Before he was exiled, before the council sealed his tablets in the Abzu, before his name was struck from the assembly rolls at Nippur, Enki sat down with 7 of his own workers on the last night he was permitted inside the temple at Eridu, and he told them 12 things about the war. Not the war they had been told about, not the war the priests would later put on the tablets for public reading. The other war, the one the council had spent 8,000 years pretending was already over, when in fact it had never stopped, had only changed rooms, had only gone underground, had only shifted from open confrontation into something quieter and much more patient. He told them the 12 things in order. He said he was telling them in order because the order mattered. He said the first 11 would sound like a history lesson, and they would be able to hold each one in their heads as a separate fact, and they might even begin to think, halfway through, that they had been given a great gift, a full accounting, the truth at last. He warned them that they would be wrong. He told them the 12th thing was the reason for the other 11, that the other 11 only made sense once the 12th was in place, and that once they heard the 12th, they would understand why the council had voted the way it had voted, why the flood had been designed the way it had been designed, why he himself was about to lose the only city he had ever built. He told them the war was not what they thought it was. He told them the sides were not what they thought they were. He told them the reason was not what any of the tablets said the reason was. And then, one at a time, in the order he had promised, he began to tell them the 12 things. What you are about to hear is that conversation, every word of it. Reconstructed from the fragments the priesthood of Eridu managed to preserve, cross-checked against the recovered lines of the Era epic, the sealed passages of the Lugal-E cycle, and the appendix to the Enuma Elish that the Ashurbanipal library kept in a separate room from the main text. The 12th thing, the one that explains everything, will be exactly where he placed it. At the end, in the order he insisted on, and by the time you reach it, you will understand why he insisted. Quick pause. And this is something new. For the first time since the 12 codes, there is a second document. It is called the 7 resets. Every time the world was erased, matched against the 12 things Enki told, and the checklist of signs for the 8th. 4 are already active. Linked below, QR code on screen. That is all. Back to the video. To understand what Enki was telling those 7 workers, you have to understand where the conversation was happening and what had already been lost by the time it started. Eridu was not just his city, it was his design. Every wall of the temple compound had been laid according to a ratio that he had chosen himself. Every water channel routed to a plan that came out of his own hand. Every stone in the central shrine set at an angle he had personally worked out on a tablet before the first foundation was dug. The city was, in a way that no other Anunnaki settlement on the earth could claim, a physical expression of the mind of a single member of the council. And by the night of the 12 things, he already knew he was going to lose it. The vote had not yet been taken. The formal exile had not yet been announced. But the assembly at Nippur had been meeting for 3 days behind closed doors, and Enki was not present at those meetings, and his brother Enlil was. And Enki knew what that combination of facts meant. He had one night. He had chosen the 7 workers carefully. They were not priests. They were not scribes. They were not from any of the marked bloodlines that the priesthood had cultivated over the previous centuries. They were, all 7 of them, workers from the outer irrigation gangs, men who had been born inside the compound but who had never been trained to write, never been assigned to a temple duty, never been considered important enough to be watched. The council would not be looking at them. The council would be looking at the priests, at the scribes, at the marked lines. The 7 workers were, by design, invisible to the mechanism that Enki knew was about to be turned on his own operations. That was why he had chosen them. He wanted the 12 things to survive, and the only way for the 12 things to survive was for them to travel through mouths that no one in the assembly considered worth listening to. He sat the 7 of them in a semicircle on the floor of the inner shrine. He did not offer them beer or bread. He did not ask them their names, because he already knew their names, and he did not want to spend any of the night on ceremony. He told them that what he was about to say would take from the 2nd hour after sunset until the last hour before dawn, and that during that time none of them was to interrupt him for any reason, including if the compound was attacked, including if the shrine itself was breached, including if one of them believed he was going to die. He told them that if he was killed before he finished, the ones still living were to keep the ones already spoken to alive at any cost, because the 12 things only worked as a set, and a set with pieces missing was, in his own words, worse than nothing. Then he began. The first thing he told them was about the war itself, what it had really been about, not what the tablets said, not what the assembly announced, what it had actually been fought over. And to tell them that first thing properly, he had to first take them back to a moment before the war had officially begun, to a moment that the council had never formally acknowledged, to a meeting in the upper chamber at Nippur, held roughly 400 years before the first shot was fired, at which a single question had been asked, and at which the answer to that question had, without anyone in the room realizing it at the time, already committed all of them to the war that would follow. That question, asked in the upper chamber 400 years before the first weapon was drawn, was this: what do we do about the ones we did not make? Not the workers, not the 7 prototypes, not the Igigi laborers who had been brought down from the orbital station to handle the excavation of the gold. Something else. Something the tablets from that era refer to only obliquely, and only in the passages that were later scraped and rewritten, and even then only in phrases like the ones who were here before the first landing, or the presence in the deep places, or, in the single most direct reference the priesthood of Eridu ever managed to preserve, the fourth party. Enki told the 7 workers that the first thing they had to understand, before he told them the first of the 12 things, was that the council had been aware, from the moment the first Anunnaki survey ship touched down in the delta of the Persian Gulf, that they were not the only intelligence operating on the planet. They had never been the only intelligence. Someone, or something, had been here first. The council did not know what it was. The council did not know where it was. The council could not measure it with the instruments they had brought down from the mother craft, and they could not draw it out into open communication, and they could not, in the end, decide even among themselves whether it was a single presence or a distributed one, whether it was conscious in the way they were conscious, or conscious in some other way entirely, whether it was hostile, or merely watchful, or genuinely indifferent to their arrival. What the council knew was that it was there, and what the council knew, from very early on, was that every major decision they made on the planet was being observed by whatever this presence was, and that whatever this presence was, it had made no attempt to introduce itself. No attempt to negotiate, no attempt to claim territory, no attempt to interfere with the mining operations or the settlement plans or the initial prototyping work at Shurapak. It simply watched. And the council, faced with a watcher it could not identify and could not communicate with, made the decision that would eventually lead to the war. It decided to build something that could talk to the watcher on the council's behalf. That was what humans were for. That was what the 7 prototypes were for. That was what the extra essence Enki poured into the 7th prototype was for. The whole project, from the first genetic experiment at Shurapak forward, was an attempt by the council to create a species that could exist on this planet in a way the Anunnaki themselves could not, a species native enough to the environment to be tolerated by whatever the watcher was, a species intelligent enough to serve as a translator between the council and the presence, a species disposable enough to lose in large numbers if the translation attempt went badly. Enki told the 7 workers, sitting on the floor of the inner shrine of Eridu on the last night he would ever spend inside his own city, that they themselves were the descendants of that translation project. That every human alive on the planet at the moment he was speaking was, in a real and literal sense, a diplomatic instrument designed by a council that did not want to admit, even to itself, that it had ever needed one. And then he told them the first of the 12 things. He told them that he was going to say each of the 12 things in a single sentence first, so they would know what was coming, and then he was going to spend as long as necessary on each one to explain why it was true and how he had come to know it was true. He said the summary sentences by themselves would not save them. He said the summary sentences by themselves would sound like riddles, or like the boasts of a defeated god, or like the mutterings of an old man who had lost his court and was trying to salvage his dignity by pretending to know secrets. He said the summary sentences would only become useful once each of them was unpacked in full. But he was going to give them the summaries anyway, in order, so that they would know the shape of what he was about to say, so that they could recognize when he was moving from one thing to the next, so that if he was interrupted before he finished, the ones who had already been listening would at least have a skeleton to hand to the ones who came after. He said, in that low, exact voice the priests would later try and fail to imitate, "Listen, the first thing is that the war was not about territory. The second thing is that the 2 sides were not the 2 sides. The third thing is that a weapon was used before the flood, and the flood was the weapon's cleanup. The fourth thing is that the gold was never the reason. The fifth thing is that a treaty was signed, and both parties broke it, and the breaking was scheduled. The sixth thing is that Enlil never wanted humans destroyed. The seventh thing is that there was a third faction, and it voted against both sides, and no one in the assembly will speak its name. The 8th thing is that the war never ended. The 9th thing is that there is a schedule for the restart, and the schedule is measured in resets, not in years. The 10th thing is that the Agigi survivors are still on this planet, embedded in specific lines, and they know who they are. The 11th thing is that what is buried at Nippur under the Black Stone is not a record of the past. It is a countdown. And the 12th thing, the one that explains everything, is the one I will only give you at the end. Because if I gave it to you now, you would not understand the first 11, and if you do not understand the first 11, the 12th will kill you. He paused. He let the 12 sit in the air of the shrine for a long moment. And then, without any preamble, without any theatrical breath, he began on the first one. The first thing, he said, is that the war was not about territory. That is the version the priests will teach. That is the version the assembly will inscribe. That is the version the tablets at Nippur will be worded in, because that is the version that fits into a single line, and single lines are what the assembly prefers when it has to explain itself to the population. The war was fought over land, they will say. The northern faction wanted the mountains. The southern faction wanted the marsh. The upper council wanted the highlands with the metal deposits. The lower council wanted the alluvial plain with the arable soil. And when the two claims could not be reconciled, and when the arbitration attempts at Nippur failed one after another for the better part of a century, the weapons were drawn, and the cities were leveled, and the earth itself was scorched in the places where the fighting had been fiercest. That is the version. That is the tablet-ready summary. That is what the schoolchildren of every future dynasty will be made to recite when the priests test them on the founding narrative of the world they have inherited. It is not what happened. It is not remotely what happened. Enki told the 7 workers that in the entire duration of the war, from the first weapon drawn to the last treaty signed at the base of Akur, not a single meter of physical territory changed hands between the two publicly declared factions. Not one. He said they could go and check the boundary markers themselves. The stones set at the 4 corners of the disputed regions before the war were the same stones sitting at the same coordinates after the war. The mining rights had not been reassigned. The city allocations had not been redrawn. The irrigation compacts had not been renegotiated. Everything that the war was supposed to have been fought over was, at the end of the war, in exactly the position it had been in at the beginning. If territory had been the reason, he said, the war would have been the most spectacular failure in the history of the council, because it accomplished, in terms of the stated goal, absolutely nothing. And the council does not fight wars that accomplish nothing. The council, whatever else you can say about it, is not stupid. It does not spend the amount of energy that was spent in that war for a set of boundary lines that end up being redrawn to their original positions. So, the war was not about territory. Then what was it about? He said the war was about a single question, and the question was this: what to do with the humans now that they were talking? The 7 workers, sitting in their semicircle on the shrine floor, did not react. They had been chosen for their stillness. But Enki could see, in the way one of them shifted his weight and in the way another one's breathing changed for a single inhale, that they had not expected the sentence. He told them to hold on to that reaction, because they were going to have it again and again and again, over the course of the night, and each time it happened it was going to be evidence that he was telling them something the tablets would not. The war, he continued, began the year the humans began speaking in coordinated sentences. Not the year they were made, not the year they were assigned to labor, not the year the first ones learned to count out grain rations or to answer a call by name. Those years had come and gone without incident. The assembly had watched them, from a distance, with the same mild curiosity it reserved for any of its other successful projects, and it had, in general, been pleased. The workers did what they were told. The workers reproduced at the rate the medical division had predicted. The workers, even in some early instances, showed a capacity for improvisation that the more optimistic members of the council had begun to interpret as a promising sign for the long-term diplomatic function the whole project had been built around. It was only when the workers began speaking to each other in sentences that had not been taught to them, in a syntax that was recognizably grammatical, in patterns that were beginning to sound like planning, that the assembly at Nippur began to have its emergency sessions. Not because the workers were dangerous. The workers, at that stage, were not dangerous. A worker with a grammatical sentence and no metallurgy could not threaten a member of the council. What was dangerous, and what the assembly understood immediately was dangerous, was that a species which had been built as a translation instrument had begun to translate on its own initiative, without being asked, without being programmed, without any input from the maker faction that would have accounted for it. The humans were, in other words, doing the thing they had been built to do, but they were doing it in a direction the council had not chosen. And the direction they were doing it in, if you track the reports coming back from the outer settlements, was outward, toward each other, toward the land, toward the presence that the whole project had been designed around. The workers were beginning to notice the Watcher, not by name, not by shape, not with any coherent theology yet, but there were reports from the villages at the edge of the marsh of workers who claimed to have heard something at night that was not any of their own kind, and there were reports from the mountain settlements to the north of workers who had begun leaving small offerings of grain at the mouths of caves for reasons they could not articulate, and there were reports from every direction of a species that was beginning to acknowledge, in its own halting terms, the existence of the fourth party. That was what triggered the emergency sessions. That was what split the council. Because now the question of what to do with the humans was no longer a management question. It was a strategic one. If the humans were going to open communication with the presence on their own, without the council's supervision, without the council's editing, without the council's ability to control what was said, then the entire purpose for which the humans had been built was going to be accomplished. But it was going to be accomplished by the humans and not by the council. And the humans, at that point, were going to be the ones the presence was talking to. Not the Anunnaki. The council saw this coming years before the fighting started. That is why the fighting started. Enki said it very plainly. The war was fought over the question of whether to let the humans finish becoming what they had been built to be. That was the question. That was the only question. Everything else, the territory, the mining rights, the succession of city lordships, the whole apparatus of grievance that the tablets would later use to explain the fighting, all of that was cover. Real cover? Elaborate cover. Cover that took entire committees of the diplomatic corps months to construct. But cover. And the two factions that formed inside the council, in those years just before the weapons were drawn, were not divided by which piece of land they wanted. They were divided by their answer to that single question. One faction, led by Enlil, said no. The humans were not to be permitted to finish. Whatever they had done spontaneously, whatever direction they had begun to move in, whatever early signs they were showing of contact with the presence, all of that was to be shut down, rolled back, edited out. If the humans had exceeded the specification was to be reasserted, and any excess capacity was to be removed. If the capacity could not be removed, the individuals carrying it were to be removed. If the individuals could not be identified, the population was to be reduced to a manageable subset and rebuilt from a controlled sample. That was the Enlil position. It was not, Enki told the 7 workers, a cruel position. It was, from the council's point of view, an entirely rational one. The council had built a tool. The tool had begun to behave outside the parameters of the design. The obvious solution was to reset the tool. Nothing personal, nothing malicious, simply engineering. The other faction, led by Enki himself, said the opposite. The humans had already done the thing they had been built to do. They had made contact, or the beginnings of contact, or at the very least the reaching motion that precedes contact, and they had done it without the council's help. That was not a failure of the design. That was the design succeeding beyond the council's ability to control it. And to reset the design at that point, Enki argued, was not engineering. It was cowardice. It was the council refusing to accept the outcome of the project it had commissioned, because the outcome did not put the council in the driver's seat. The council was afraid, he said, of a creature it had built that had begun to act like a person. And the council's answer to being afraid of a person was to unmake the person, which, Enki said, was not the answer of a governing body that deserved to keep governing. That was the split. Those were the two factions. That was what the war was actually about. Not land, not gold, not mining rights. A single question about what to do with a species that had begun, without permission, to fulfill its own purpose. Enki paused. He looked at the 7 workers. He said, and this is the part you have to remember when you carry the first thing forward. Both sides lost. Enlil lost, because the humans were not rolled back. You are still here. You are, all 7 of you, evidence that his faction did not get what it wanted, and I lost, because the humans were not allowed to finish becoming what they had been built to be either. The redesign, which is still ongoing, which has been ongoing for 8,000 years, is the compromise that came out of the treaty at the end of the war. It is neither a rollback nor a completion. It is a slow, incremental adjustment of the design, aimed at producing a version of the human that can make contact with the presence, but only through channels the council controls. That is where you are now. In the middle of the compromise, that is the first thing. And it explains a number of things you may have already begun to notice about the way the priesthood behaves toward any human who claims to have heard something on his own. It explains why the temple system was built around monopolizing the interpretation of dreams. It explains why the practice of solitary prayer was, until very recently in the history of your species, considered a form of subversion punishable by exile. It explains why the caste that eventually became the priesthood of every dynasty this planet has ever produced spends most of its energy not on communion with anything, but on making sure no unauthorized communion happens elsewhere. The priesthood is not a religious institution. The priesthood is a firewall, and the firewall exists because the compromise that ended the war required one. He said this last part almost dryly, as if he were reading from a report. Then he moved on to the second thing. The second thing, he told the 7 workers, is that the 2 sides were not the 2 sides. The tablets will tell you that the war was fought between the northern faction and the southern faction, or between the maker line and the administrator line, or between the followers of Enki and the followers of Enlil. All of those are true, in the sense that all of those factional labels really did apply to real groupings inside the council. And there really were fights, and there really were positions, and the positions really did break along those lines in the assembly votes. But those were not the 2 sides that were actually fighting the war. Those were the 2 sides that the council allowed to be visible. The war that mattered, the one that was moving underneath the visible one, had a different geometry entirely. Enki said it this way. He said, on the surface, the war looked like a family argument. 2 brothers, 2 hierarchies, 2 philosophies of governance, going at each other in the way ruling families have always gone at each other since the first ruling family was ever assembled. That was the story. That was the narrative the council could tolerate. That was the narrative the council needed the humans to see, because a family argument, even a violent one, is a story a human can understand. A human can look at 2 brothers fighting and locate himself in relation to that fight. He can pick a side. He can side with the older brother or the younger brother. He can side with the harsher one or the gentler one. He can side with the one who claims justice or the one who claims mercy. Whatever he picks, the picking itself keeps him inside the story. And inside the story is the only thing. The picture behind the story does not exist. That was the point of the family narrative. It was a story large enough and dramatic enough and morally legible enough to occupy every available cubic centimeter of human attention, so that no human, ever, would look past the story to what was actually happening. What was actually happening, Enki said, was that the split inside the council was not 2-sided. It was 3-sided. And the third side, the one that was neither Enlil's faction nor Enki's faction, was the one that was quietly running the war. He said this with a kind of tired precision. The 2 visible factions, he said, were both being managed. Both, his own faction included. Neither Enlil nor Enki had been fully in control of the decisions their own sides had made, and neither of them had understood, until very late in the war, that the entire time they had been fighting each other, a third grouping inside the council had been feeding them their positions, feeding them their intelligence, feeding them their justifications, and, most importantly, feeding them the timing of the escalations. The third grouping did not appear in any of the public roles. It did not have a designated name. It did not vote as a block in any of the assemblies, because to vote as a block would have been to reveal itself. Instead, its members sat individually in both the visible factions, and they moved their agenda through the votes of others, through the counsel they gave in the private chambers, through the reports they filed with the diplomatic corps, through the small edits they made to the language of the treaties before those treaties were ratified. They were, functionally, the referees of the war. And no one in either of the visible factions had asked them to referee anything. Who were they? Enki said the third grouping was made up of the members of the council who had, at various points in the pre-war years, been sent to the outer settlements on what were officially recorded as diagnostic tours. Diagnostic tours were the assembly's term for the practice of dispatching a council member, alone, without a support team, to spend an extended period among the workers in one of the peripheral villages, ostensibly to file a report on the health of the population, the productivity of the labor gangs, the state of the irrigation, the level of unrest, and any other metric the council needed a first-hand account of. Diagnostic tours had been introduced very early in the settlement period, When the council had realized that its picture of the workers was being filtered through the priests, who were themselves being filtered through the temple bureaucracy, and that the picture arriving at Nippur bore very little resemblance to the situation on the ground. So they had begun sending council members out in person, individually, quietly, for months at a time, and the reports had come back, in the beginning, exactly as expected. Diagnostic, statistical, dry. It was only later, Enki said, decades later, when he began to compare the trajectories of the various council members who had gone on diagnostic tours, that he noticed the pattern. The council members who had done the most tours, and the longest tours, and the tours in the most remote settlements, were the same council members who, in the assembly, seemed to always occupy the middle position. They did not vote consistently with Enlil. They did not vote consistently with him. They did not vote as a block with each other. They voted, individually, in whichever direction produced the exact outcome that kept the balance of the assembly from ever tipping decisively toward either of the visible factions. Whenever Enlil's side seemed about to consolidate a permanent majority, one of them would drift toward Enki's side, just enough to prevent it. Whenever Enki's side seemed about to consolidate a permanent majority, one of them would drift toward Enlil's side, just enough to prevent it. The war, as a result, could never be won by either side. It could only be sustained. And the sustained state was, from the point of view of whatever grouping was doing this drifting, apparently the desired outcome. Enki said he had counted, at the height of the war, 17 members of the council who fit this profile. 17, out of an assembly of 50. Enough, if they had ever coordinated openly, to swing any vote in the chamber. But they had not coordinated openly. They had coordinated in the way currents in a river coordinate, without conversation, without leadership, without any visible mechanism at all. And that, Enki told the 7 workers, was the second thing they had to understand. The war was not between two sides. It was between two sides that were themselves being played by a third side that had spent its entire existence pretending it was not a side. And the third side was still there, still in the council, still voting, still filing diagnostic reports, still, in the assembly that was about to exile him, occupying the middle chairs, saying very little, but ensuring, through their small drifts and their careful abstentions, that the vote to expel him would pass with exactly the margin the third side had wanted it to pass with. Not too large, not too small, just enough to make the outcome look natural. Enki told the 7 workers that he had a name for the 17, though it was not a name he ever used in the assembly, because to use it in the assembly would have been to accuse without proof. He called them, in his own private notes, the balancers. Not to signal that they were neutral. They were not neutral. Nothing about the drift he had observed suggested neutrality. Balancers, in his usage, was a diagnostic term. It described a function, not a virtue. The 17 existed to keep the war from ending. They existed to keep any single position from consolidating. They existed to hold the whole council in a state of permanent, unresolvable tension, so that the visible factions could exhaust themselves at each other, while the deeper agenda, whatever it actually was, moved forward under the cover of the exhaustion. And the deeper agenda, Enki said, was not something he could name even at that point in the conversation. He said he was not withholding it. He genuinely did not know. He knew there was one. He knew the 17 were serving one. He knew the drift patterns he had documented were not random and could not be explained by any of the visible motivations of the assembly. But whether the deeper agenda originated inside the council itself, or whether it originated somewhere else, and whether the 17 were the servants of a small group of instigators, or the servants of a single instigator, or the servants of something that was not, strictly speaking, a member of the council at all, he did not, on that night, know. What he knew was that the two visible sides were not the real sides. What he knew was that both he and Enlil had been, in a sense he had only recently understood, played. And what he knew was that if the 7 workers went out into the world after this night, with the assumption that the war had been a two-way conflict, and that the resolution of the war had been a two-way treaty, and that the priesthood that had grown up in the aftermath of the war represented the interests of only 2 of the parties that had signed that treaty, they were going to misread every subsequent event in the history of this planet, every single one, because the third side was still in the room, still voting, still drifting, still. From the diagnostic tours it continued to conduct through generations of council members who came after Enki himself was gone, calibrating the tensions inside the assembly to keep the war going in its underground form for however long the deeper agenda required. That is the second thing. It is uglier than the first. It gets uglier still. He looked at the 7 workers, and he saw one of them, the youngest, close his eyes for a moment, and then open them, and then nod once, as if to say he had received the sentence and was ready for the next one. Enki nodded back, and he moved to the third thing. The third thing, he said, is that a weapon was used before the flood, and the flood was the weapon's cleanup. The tablets will tell you the flood was the primary event, that the flood was the decision, that the assembly, faced with a humanity that had grown too numerous and too noisy, resolved to erase the surface of the planet with a controlled inundation, and then, in the aftermath, to restart the population from a curated remnant. That is the version. That is the version he himself had helped, in a very limited way, to preserve by tipping off Ziusudra through the reed wall, so that the curated remnant would include at least one line that had not been chosen by the assembly. He said the tablet version was accurate as far as it went. There had, in fact, been a flood. It had, in fact, been engineered. And the assembly had, in fact, ordered it. But the flood was not what the flood is remembered as. The flood was not a beginning, or a punishment, or a purification. The flood was a cover story. Something else had happened before the flood, and the something else was the reason the flood had been necessary. And no tablet anywhere in any archive on this planet describes what the something else actually was, because the something else was, by unanimous decision of the assembly, made an unspeakable event. Not unspeakable in the moral sense, unspeakable in the technical sense. Erased from the record, prohibited from discussion, referenced, if at all, only through euphemism. The euphemism the assembly settled on, and the one the priests would carry forward for the rest of history, was the correction. Enki said that word aloud once, and let it sit, and then he said, that is what they called it, the correction. As if it were a small edit to a manuscript, as if it were a scribe fixing a slipped stylus mark, as if the thing had been small. It had not been small. The correction, he told the 7 workers, was a weapon, a specific weapon, constructed in the deep facilities under the mountain range to the northeast of Nippur, on the basis of a design that had been brought down from the mother craft and never authorized for terrestrial deployment before that moment. It had been kept in reserve, in the treaty language of the initial landing agreements, for a category of emergency that had never been precisely defined, but that everyone in the assembly had understood to mean the outbreak of hostilities with something the council could not defeat by conventional means. It was, in other words, the weapon of last resort, and it was deployed, roughly 140 years before the flood, in a region south of the marsh, in a set of settlements whose names had been struck from every subsequent tablet against a population that had been declared, by decree of the assembly, no longer human. Enki paused there, because he wanted the 7 workers to hear that phrase, not human, declared by vote of the assembly, no longer belonging to the category the workers themselves belonged to. He said the reason for the declaration had been simple, on the surface, and complicated underneath. On the surface, the population in question had begun to exhibit a set of behaviors that the medical division could not classify. They had begun to speak in patterns the linguists could not parse. They had begun to build structures the surveyors could not identify the purpose of. They had begun, above all, to gather at specific locations, on specific nights, in specific numbers, and to do things at those gatherings that the observers who had been sent to watch them could not describe in coherent report language. The reports came back with holes in them. Not because the observers were incompetent, because whatever the population was doing, the observers, being members of the council, did not have the perceptual apparatus to see it clearly. The council concluded, on the basis of these degraded reports, that the population in question had made contact. That is the term the medical division used, contact, which meant, in the private vocabulary of the upper chambers, that the humans in those settlements had begun communicating with the fourth party, not reaching, not aspiring, not offering, actually communicating, in both directions, receiving and responding. And the responses, according to the fragments the observers had managed to file before their reports began coming back full of gaps, were changing the behavior of the population in ways the council could no longer predict, no longer influence, and, most seriously, no longer roll back. The workers in those southern settlements had passed some threshold. Whatever had happened at their gatherings had not just been contact, it had been contact that had taken. The population had integrated something, and the something they had integrated was not from the council. That was the situation the assembly was faced with, roughly 140 years before the flood. And the assembly, after 7 days of closed deliberation, took the vote. Not the vote for the flood. That vote would come later. This was the vote for the correction. Enki said he had been in the room for the vote. He had voted against. Ninhursag had voted against. A handful of the lower council members had voted against. But the vote had passed by a comfortable margin, and the weapon that had been sitting in reserve under the northeastern mountains had been brought out, and the deployment order had been signed, and, over the course of a single night, the settlements in question had been reduced to a condition the surveyors sent in afterward could not, in their reports, agree on how to describe. Some of them called it vitrification. Some of them called it sublimation. Some of them wrote that the ground itself had been changed at a level below the visible. What was consistent across all the reports was that nothing had been left alive in the target zone, and that the target zone extended, in every direction, well past the boundaries of the settlements that had actually been the subjects of the vote. The weapon had not been precise. It had not been designed to be precise. It had been designed to remove, from the record of the earth, any residue of whatever had been happening at those gatherings, and that meant the removal of the earth itself in the areas where the residue might have accumulated. Not just the people, the soil, the stone, the water tables, everything down to a certain depth, simply gone. And after it was gone, the assembly had a problem. The problem was that the correction, however successful it had been at removing the target population, had left behind a scar on the planet's surface that was going to be visible from orbit for the next several thousand years, and that was going to be visible on the ground to the surrounding populations that had not been targeted for as long as those surrounding populations retained the ability to see. Something had to be done about the scar. And something had to be done about the memory of the surrounding populations who had seen the sky change on the night of the correction, who had felt the ground move, who had, in some cases, who been close enough to the target zone to have been affected by the edge effects, and who would, if not addressed, carry the memory of what had happened forward into whatever civilizations they eventually built. That was where the flood came from. The flood was not a decision to end humanity. The flood was a decision to end the memory of the correction. Everything else about the flood, the numbers of dead, the choice of who to save, the way it was executed, was engineered downstream of that first requirement. The scar had to be buried. The witnesses had to be removed. The surrounding populations had to be reduced to a state from which they would not be able to reconstruct what they had seen, would not be able to pass it on to their descendants, would not be able to compare notes with the surrounding regions and realize, over the course of generations, that all of them had seen the same thing on the same night. A flood accomplished all of that. A flood buried the scar under sediment. A flood killed the witnesses. A flood scrambled the survivor populations badly enough that the fragments of memory each of them carried forward could not, once they resettled, be reassembled into a coherent picture. A flood was, from the assembly's point of view, the only measure available that could clean up the correction without leaving evidence of the cleanup itself. And so the flood was called, and so the flood was executed. And so the tablets that were written afterward, by the priests of the survivor populations, spoke only of the flood and never of the correction, because none of the survivors remembered the correction clearly enough to speak of it, and because the ones among them who did remember something were, by careful design of the resettlement policy, distributed across settlement patterns that prevented any two of them from ever comparing what they had remembered. Enki said this with the flatness of a man reading a technical manual. He said the flood had been, in operational terms, one of the most successful actions the council had ever undertaken. The memory had been erased. The scar had been buried. The workers who came after the flood had no notion, none, that anything had preceded the flood except an unbroken sequence of ordinary human life going back to the making. The correction had, effectively, never happened, which was the point of the flood. Enki told the 7 workers that if they took nothing else from the third thing, they were to take this. The flood is a false horizon. The tablets treat it as the earliest disaster, the founding disaster, the event before which nothing worth remembering occurred. That treatment is not an accident of scholarship. That treatment is the intended output of a specific policy decision, made at Nippur, in the aftermath of an event that was worse than the flood, and that the flood was designed to conceal. The horizon is fake. There is history behind it. And the history behind it, he said, is what you have to reach if you want to understand why the war was fought, why the treaty was signed, why the assembly still meets, and why the correction, though it has not been used since, is still, at this moment, sitting in reserve under those same northeastern mountains. Waiting. That is the third thing. The fourth thing, he said, is that the gold was never the reason. This one you will have the hardest time hearing, because the gold is the story you have been told the longest, and the one that has been repeated by the widest variety of sources, and the one that has, more than any other single detail, given the entire history of the Council a coherent motive that ordinary humans can understand. The Council came for the gold. The Council needed the gold to repair the atmosphere of the home world. The Council could not process the gold in the volumes required without a labor force, and the workers were built to supply that labor force, and the whole 8,000-year presence of the Anunnaki on this planet was, at bottom, an industrial operation whose reason for existence was the extraction of a single metal. That is the story. It appears on the tablets. It appears in the temple hymns. It appears in the training documents given to the priests. It appears in every place the priesthood has been able to put it. And it is, from beginning to end, a manufactured explanation. Enki said the gold operation had been real. The mines had existed. The Igigi had, in fact, been brought down from the orbital station to work them, and the workers had eventually, after the Igigi mutiny, been made in part to replace them. The gold had been extracted. It had been shipped up. Some of it had, in some form, been used for the purposes the tablets described. That much was accurate. What was not accurate was the notion that the gold operation had been the purpose of the presence on the planet. It had been, from the first landing forward, a cover. A very good cover. A cover so operationally real, so genuinely resourced, so completely staffed with people who believed they were working on it for its own sake, that even most members of the council would, if asked, have said the gold was the reason. Because most members of the council did not know it was not. The knowledge that the gold was cover was held, on the day of the first landing, by the 7 original members of the survey team, of whom Enki was one. By the day of the conversation with the 7 workers, that number had grown, but not by much. Fewer than 20 living members of the council understood that the entire industrial infrastructure they had built on the surface of this planet had been raised, from the first foundation stone forward, around a purpose the workforce was not permitted to see. That purpose, he said, was the presence. The fourth party, the Watcher. The Anunnaki had not come to this planet because they needed gold. They had come to this planet because they had detected, from a considerable distance, that something was here. Something that had not communicated with them. Something that appeared to have been here for longer than any of the council's records went back. Something that was not, according to their instruments, native to this system. And the council, on the strength of that detection, had launched a survey mission with instructions to make contact if possible and to establish an observational presence if not. Contact had not been possible. The survey team had probed for it, in every way they knew how to probe, and the presence had not responded. It had also not left. It had also not attacked. It had simply held whatever position it held, which was not a physical position in any sense the survey team could triangulate, and continued whatever activity it was engaged in, which was not an activity in any sense the survey team could catalog, which meant the second half of the original instruction had gone into effect. Establish an observational presence. And an observational presence, for a species that lived on the timescale the Anunnaki lived on, meant something considerably larger than a small crew on a hilltop. It meant a permanent settlement. It meant infrastructure. It meant, over the course of centuries, the construction of a full operational base capable of supporting a large population of council members and their support staff for as long as the observation required. And a permanent settlement of that size, on a planet inhabited by intelligences that had not consented to your presence, needed a public reason. Gold was the public reason. Gold was chosen, Enki said, because it was defensible in every direction. It was scarce enough on the home world to justify the expenditure. It was abundant enough on this planet to make the extraction plausible. It required labor-intensive processing, which justified the size of the workforce. It required precise ore body identification, which justified the presence of the geological survey teams that were, in fact, doing something else with their instruments. It required refining infrastructure, which justified the construction of the large industrial compounds that were, in fact, housing something else. Every element of the gold operation had been designed so that if any outsider, whether a member of the workforce or a delegation from the homeworld or the presence itself, ever inspected any part of it, they would find a gold operation, a real one, running, producing, shipping, and the real operation, the observation of the presence, would be tucked into the interstices of the cover operation, where no inspection would ever look. Enki said this had worked. It had worked for 8,000 years. The workforce had never suspected. the tablets had never questioned. Even the priesthood, which knew more about the actual internal politics of the council than any other human institution, had never developed a coherent doubt about the gold. The gold was, in the priestly imagination, simply what the council was here for. And that suited the council fine, because as long as everyone thought the council was here for the gold, no one was looking for what the council was actually here for, and the observation of the presence could continue, uninterrupted, at a level of resource commitment that no purely industrial operation could ever have justified. Then, he said, the war came, and the war changed the situation, because the war exposed something the cover story had not been designed to survive. During the war, when the two visible factions were fighting each other openly, the internal communications of the council became less secure. Messages that had been intended to travel only through the upper channels began, under wartime conditions, to be routed through channels that included lower-ranked staff. Some of those staff members were priests. Some of those priests were the older, more thoughtful ones. The ones who had already begun to suspect that the story they had been telling their congregations did not fit the observations they had been making in the field. Those priests, over the course of the war, began to collect fragments. A phrase here, a memo there, a misdirected report that mentioned the presence by one of the euphemisms the council used in its private communications. And by the end of the war, at least 3 of them, working independently in 3 different temple complexes, had assembled enough of the fragments to understand that the gold was not what they had been told it was. They did not have the complete picture. They did not know what the presence was, or where it was, or what the council was actually trying to do about it. But they knew, by then, that the gold operation was a shell around something else. And they knew, though they could not prove it, that whatever that something else was, it was the real reason their species existed. The council was aware, Enki said, that these 3 priests knew. The intelligence corps had picked up on their inquiries within the first year of their independent investigations, and the council had made a decision about them, which was that none of them was to be killed. Killing them would have created martyrs, and martyrs would have created followings, and followings would have created inquiries, and inquiries would eventually have surfaced the very information the council was trying to keep buried. Instead, the 3 priests were to be quietly absorbed into the deep priesthood, the inner tier that the assembly used for the most sensitive functions, and given, at that level, a partial version of the truth, enough to make them feel included, enough to give them a stake in keeping the outer priesthood ignorant, not enough to let them see the full picture. That is how the priesthood ended up, over generations, structured the way it is now structured. An outer tier that believes the tablets, a middle tier that has been told parts of the cover story but not the cover under the cover, and an inner tier, very small, that knows the gold was never the reason, but does not know, in any detail, what the actual reason is. Even at the innermost level, the priesthood is on a need-to-know basis. And the need has, over the course of the 8,000 years since the war, been consistently rationed to the smallest amount the council could get away with rationing. Enki looked at the 7 workers. He said, and this is what you have to take from the 4th thing. Every temple that has ever been built on this planet, every priesthood that has ever served in any of those temples, every hymn that has ever been sung in praise of the council, or of the gold, or of the labor of the workers, all of it, without exception, has been built on top of a lie about the reason the council came here. Not a small lie, not an ordinary lie. The largest lie that has ever been sustained by any institution on the surface of this planet for any period of time. And the workers, all of you, have been living inside it. Not because you were stupid, because you had no way to see out of it. The whole architecture of your civilization has been shaped to prevent you from seeing out of it. The gold is a wall, and the wall was built by architects who had every intention of keeping you inside it. That is the 4th thing. The 5th thing, he said, is that a treaty was signed at the end of the war, and both sides broke it, and the breaking was scheduled. The treaty is real. It exists. If you go to Nippur, and if you find the priest whose duty it is to catalog the underlayers of the archive, and if you convince him, by whatever means, to show you the sealed cabinet on the northern wall of the 2nd underground room, you will find the tablet. It is not a large tablet, roughly the size of a man's forearm, inscribed on both sides, sealed at the corners with wax impressions bearing the personal marks of the 50 original council members and the 7 judges and the presiding officer of the assembly. It is the founding legal document of the world you currently live in. Every subsequent treaty on this planet, every law code from Ur to Babylon and forward, every arbitration ruling, every land grant, every marriage contract, every commercial agreement, every religious ordination, ultimately draws its authority from the ratification structure that was established by that tablet. It is, in an entirely literal sense, the constitution of the compromise. And it was, from the day it was sealed, designed to be broken. Enki said the design of the treaty was, in his professional opinion, elegant. He said that, in the voice of a craftsman describing a rival's work, he had not written the treaty himself. He had been consulted on portions of it. He had ratified it, with his own seal, on the day it was presented to the assembly. But the language of the document, the actual paragraph-by-paragraph construction of the terms, had been done by a small drafting committee whose membership overlapped, he had realized in retrospect, almost entirely with the 17 balancers. They had written a treaty that gave both sides everything they had asked for in the visible negotiations, and that included, buried in the technical clauses, a series of triggers and expirations and conditional reversions that guaranteed, on a timeline the balancers alone had calculated, that both sides would eventually be forced to violate it. Not because either side was faithless, because the treaty had been built to make faithlessness inevitable. Enki gave the 7 workers an example. He said one of the clauses in the treaty had specified that the humans, going forward, would be managed under a joint administration, with the maker faction retaining authority over the initial design, and the administrator faction retaining authority over subsequent modifications. That sounded, on the surface, like a reasonable division. It preserved his own faction's authority over the base template of the species, which had been his central demand in the negotiations, and it gave Enlil's faction authority over any rollbacks or edits that might become necessary in the future, which had been his central demand. What the clause did not specify, and what neither of the visible factions had noticed in the drafting sessions, was any mechanism for adjudicating the boundary between the two authorities. When did an edit to the human template count as a modification, which was Enlil's jurisdiction, and when did it count as a change to the initial design, which was Enki's? The treaty did not say, it listed no criteria, it named no arbitrator, it provided no appeal process. It simply stated the two authorities, side by side, and left it to future generations of the council to work out where one ended and the other began. Which meant, in practice, that every single time either faction wanted to make an adjustment to the humans, the other faction could plausibly claim the adjustment fell under its own jurisdiction, and the resulting dispute could not be settled within the framework of the treaty itself. It had to be settled outside the treaty, which meant, in effect, that it could only be settled by unilateral action by whichever faction moved first, or by fresh negotiation, in which the balancers would once again mediate, and in which the balancers would once again ensure that the outcome preserved the tension between the two visible sides without resolving it. Every single modification to the human template that has occurred since the war, Enki said, has followed this pattern. Faction A wants to make a change. Faction B objects. The objection cannot be arbitrated. Faction A acts unilaterally, or the balancers convene a fresh negotiation and arrange a partial concession that leaves the underlying dispute unresolved. Cycle repeats. Over 8,000 years, this cycle has produced dozens of modifications to your species. None of them agreed on, all of them contested, each of them justified by the faction that pushed it through, as a legitimate exercise of authority under the treaty, and each of them denounced by the faction that opposed it, as a violation of the treaty, which they all technically were. But because the treaty had no adjudication mechanism, the violations could not be prosecuted, and the modifications stood. He said the same design pattern was repeated in almost every substantive clause of the document. The clause on Igigi resettlement, the clause on temple governance, the clause on land allocation, the clause on the succession of city lordships. All of them stated principles without specifying how the principles would be applied, and all of them, therefore, generated disputes that had to be resolved outside the treaty, and each of those extra treaty resolutions was, technically, a violation. The whole document was a machine for producing violations. The violations were the point. Every violation deepened the dependence of both factions on the balancer function, because only the balancers were positioned to broker the extra treaty resolutions that the violations required. And every such brokered resolution strengthened the balancer's hand in the assembly, and pushed the actual center of power in the council further and further away from the two visible factions, and closer to the third side that had drafted the treaty in the first place. That is what Enki meant when he said the breaking was scheduled. The treaty had been designed, from the first ratifying seal, to generate its own violations on a predictable timeline, and to convert each of those violations into a further consolidation of power by the drafting committee. By the time of the conversation with the 7 workers, roughly 4,000 years into the operation of the treaty, the pattern was already visible to anyone in the council who cared to look at the assembly rolls. But the pattern was not being called out, because the 2 visible factions had, over the intervening centuries, come to depend on the balancer function so completely that neither of them could remember how to make a decision without it. The Maker faction called for the balancers whenever it needed a modification pushed through against Enlil's objection. The Administrator faction called for the balancers whenever it needed a rollback pushed through against Enki's objection. Both sides had, in a sense, delegated their sovereignty to the third side, one small concession at a time, over the course of 4,000 years, without ever formally acknowledging that they had done so. Enki said this was what had made the exile inevitable. He had, in the year preceding the conversation, begun to say out loud, in the assembly, what he had known privately for centuries: that the treaty was a trap, that the balancers were not neutral, that the compromise at the end of the war had not, in fact, been a compromise between the 2 visible factions, but a mechanism by which a third grouping had established permanent quiet control over the council's decisions about the humans. And the moment he began to say those things out loud, the balancers had moved to remove him, not by argument, not by countervote, by the same mechanism they had used for 4,000 years to shape the assembly's decisions. By small drifts, by careful abstentions, by private conversations with individual council members who would then, in the visible sessions, argue, on their own initiative, for Enki's removal, without ever realizing that the arguments they were making had been placed in their heads by the diagnostic tour veterans of the balancer group. It was, he said, an elegant execution of an elegant design. And there was no procedural route left within the treaty by which he could stop it. The treaty had been built to accommodate this exact eventuality. When a council member became a threat to the balancer function, the treaty provided a removal process that could be triggered by exactly the kind of drift the balancers were specialists in producing. He had walked into the trap 8,000 years before, when he had ratified the document, and the trap had been closing around him ever since. That is why he was going to lose Eridu. That is why the vote at Nippur was going to pass. That is the 5th thing. And it explains, he told the 7 workers, something you have already begun to notice if you have ever paid attention to how the priests at Nippur behave when a dispute arises between the temples. There is always a third party. There is always the arbitrating priest, the mediating scribe, the neutral witness whose recommendation somehow always turns out to be what the highest-ranking priest in the room quietly wanted. That behavior is not a habit. That behavior is a template. And the template was set 4,000 years before those priests were born, at the drafting of the treaty that produced the world they inherited. The 6th thing, he said, is that Enlil never wanted humans destroyed. This will contradict most of what has been said about him in the assembly, and most of what will be said about him for the rest of history, and most of what you yourselves have been trained to believe. Enlil is the villain. Enlil is the one who voted for the flood. Enlil is the one who has argued, in every subsequent generation, for rollbacks, for restrictions, for smaller populations, for tighter controls, for edits that reduce the range of what a human being is capable of. That is his record. That is the tablet version of his position. And, as with the gold and the territory and the sides of the war, it is accurate as far as it goes. And it is misleading in every direction that matters, Enki said. And this is one of the few moments in the transcript where the recording priest noted that his voice changed, that Enlil was the only member of the council he had ever fully trusted, not agreed with, not gotten along with, not even, most of the time, been able to be in the same room with for more than an hour, but trusted. He said he had trusted Enlil because Enlil, alone among the council, had never lied to him, not about anything, not about the small things, and not about the large ones. When Enlil voted against him, Enlil told him beforehand exactly why he was voting against him. When Enlil disagreed with him, Enlil laid out the disagreement in full, in the assembly, in language that could be quoted. When Enlil was going to move against him, Enlil said so. And when Enlil made a decision that Enki could not stand, which was often, Enki always knew, with certainty, why the decision had been made, because Enlil had never in his life made a decision for a reason he was not willing to state publicly. That, Enki said, is a rare quality in a member of any governing body. It is rarer still in a governing body that has been operating for 8,000 years under an unspoken cover story. And it made Enlil, for all his stiffness, For all his willingness to vote for measures Enki considered barbaric, the only member of the council whose motivations could be predicted with any accuracy. Which meant, in turn, that Enki could tell you, with certainty, what Enlil had actually wanted for the humans. And what Enlil had wanted for the humans was not their destruction. What Enlil had wanted for the humans was that they remain what they had originally been designed to be: a labor force, a modest, functional, contained population, doing the tasks the council had assigned them, living the lives the council had scoped out, dying in the numbers the medical division had planned for, and, above all, not attempting to reach past the boundaries the design had set for them. That was Enlil's position from the beginning. It was, in a sense, the position of a man who took the design specifications seriously. The humans had been built for a purpose. That purpose was diplomatic translation with the presence, but only under council supervision. Anything the humans did outside that purpose was a deviation, and deviations, in Enlil's view, were bad engineering. Not evil, not immoral, just wrong. In the way that a machine part that has expanded outside its tolerances is wrong. When Enlil voted for the flood, he did not vote for the destruction of humanity. He voted, in the exact terms recorded in the assembly minutes, for the reduction of the population to a level at which the deviations could be corrected without destabilizing the design. Reduction, not elimination. Correction, not annihilation. If Enlil had wanted the humans destroyed, he could have voted, at any point during the war, for the deployment of the correction weapon against the general population, and the correction weapon would have done to humanity what it had done to those settlements south of the marsh. Nothing left. No sediment burial required. No survivor problem. He did not vote for that. Not once. Not in any of the closed sessions Enki was in the room for, and not in any of the sessions he was not in the room for that the Intelligence Corps subsequently reported on. Enlil voted, consistently, for measures that preserved humanity as a population while reducing its capacity for further deviation. The flood was the largest of those measures, not the only one. There have been many smaller ones in the 8,000 years since. Every plague that has moved through your species at the rate the medical division has quietly deemed acceptable, every famine that has been permitted to run its course when it could have been intervened in, every dynasty that has been allowed to collapse when the council could have propped it up, every dark century in which the accumulated knowledge of the preceding centuries has been permitted to be lost, all of it, without exception, has borne the fingerprint of Enlil's engineering philosophy. Reduce, correct, preserve the base template, do not innovate, do not indulge deviations. Do not, under any circumstances, allow a version of the human to develop that operates outside the parameters of the specification. That was his position. It was consistent. It was, in its own terms, principled. And it was, Enki said, not the same thing as wanting them destroyed. Enki wanted the 7 workers to understand this because misunderstanding it, he said, was the single most common error made by any human who tried to interpret the history of the council. If you thought Enlil was a genocidal villain, you would misread every subsequent event in that history. You would misread the flood. You would misread the plagues. You would misread the collapse of Ur, and the collapse of Akkad, and the collapse of every subsequent civilization that has fallen at what appeared to be a natural point in its own decline. All of those events, from Enlil's point of view, were maintenance. Not punishment, maintenance. And to read them as punishment was to give Enlil a moral weight he neither claimed nor deserved. It was to make him the kind of god who could be prayed to for mercy, which was, in Enki's professional opinion, the single largest theological error the priesthood had ever committed. Enlil did not do mercy. Enlil did not do cruelty. Enlil did maintenance. And the humans who prayed to him for mercy were, in a sense that Enlil himself would have found ridiculous, praying to the wrong deity for the wrong thing. Then, why the reputation? Why the tablets that portray him as a wrathful destroyer? Why the entire theological apparatus that has grown up, in the centuries since the flood, around the fear of Enlil as a personified cosmic anger? Enki said the reputation was, again, cover. Cover manufactured, not by Enlil himself, and not by the Maker faction, and not by the priests, but by the balancers, the 17. The third side, they had a vested interest, from the day of the treaty forward, in keeping the 2 visible factions readable as a moral binary. Good side and bad side, merciful side and wrathful side, kind father and stern father, because a moral binary is the easiest configuration to manage. If humanity understood Enlil the way he actually was, as a diligent, unsentimental engineer, they would have no reason to hate him, and no reason to love the opposing faction, and no reason to see the council as divided into two poles at all. They would begin to look for a third pole. And the moment they began to look for a third pole, they would find one, and the whole management structure of the last 4,000 years would begin to unravel. So the Balancers had, over generations, encouraged the priesthood to teach Enlil as villain, softly, deniably, never in official statements. But in the emphasis of the temple hymns, in the choice of which of his interventions to remember and which to forget, in the language that surrounded his name in the ritual liturgies, the picture of Enlil that reached the population was consistently the picture of a wrathful destroyer, and consistently different from the picture of Enlil that anyone who had actually served in the assembly with him would have recognized. Enki said this had been, in his opinion, one of the crueler things the Balancers had done, not because Enlil personally cared about his reputation among a workforce he considered barely worth speaking to. He did not, but because the mischaracterization had, over generations, produced a religious dynamic that placed the humans in a permanent state of fear before a version of Enlil that did not exist, while leaving them defenseless against the version of the council that actually did exist, and that was quietly making the decisions the population attributed to Enlil. That mischaracterization is still in operation. It is in operation in the theology of every religion currently practiced on this planet, in one form or another, whether the humans practicing those religions call the destroying god by Enlil's name or by any of the dozens of names the Balancers have arranged, over the centuries, to attach to him. Enki said the fear of a wrathful sky is a manufactured product. The wrathful sky does not exist. The maintenance engineer does. And the maintenance engineer is not, and has never been, the one who wants your species destroyed. The one who wants your species destroyed, if there is one, is elsewhere. That is the sixth thing. The seventh thing, he said, and here his voice dropped, because this was the one he had been considering for weeks, whether to include it all, is that there was a third faction, not the Balancers. The Balancers are a mechanism, not a faction. A faction has positions. A faction argues in the assembly. A faction can be spoken to in the language of coalitions, and coalitions can be spoken back to. The Balancers are not a faction in that sense. They are a distributed function. They exist in the interstices of the two visible factions, and they operate without a coherent public voice. What Enki was about to describe was different. It was a third faction in the traditional sense. It had positions. It voted. It occupied a set of chairs in the assembly. And it had, at every major decision point in the war and after the war, voted against both of the other two. Neither for Enki's side, nor for Enlil's side, against both. And the fact that it had done so, consistently, across 4,000 years of council business, had been noticed by almost no one, because the third faction had made a policy, from very early in its existence, of never speaking about its votes in the assembly and never explaining them in the private chambers. It simply voted, and it went home. And it did not defend itself, and it did not seek allies, and it did not, in any conventional sense, try to win. It voted for the record, and the record, Enki said, if you knew where to look, was extraordinary. The third faction, he said, was the Underworld Council, not a metaphor, not a theological figure, an actual working subcommittee of the assembly, made up of members of the council who had, over generations, been assigned to what the tablets refer to obliquely as the lower administration, the oversight of the dead, the management of the passages between the states of being, the disposition of the essences that leave the living population and pass, in the terms of the older cosmology, into the region below. Every functioning civilization the council had ever built had required an underworld administration, because every functioning civilization produced dead, and the dead had to be processed, sorted, and either recycled into new instances of the design or archived in the appropriate storage. That processing was, in the council's operational language, one of the least glamorous and most essential functions of the administration. And the members who did it, over time, developed a very specific perspective on the human project that no other member of the council developed. Enki said the underworld administrators had watched, over 4,000 years, the actual outcome of every design decision the council had ever made about humans. They had seen, individual by individual, essence by essence, what happened to the humans after the humans died. They had seen the patterns. They had seen which modifications produced essences that could be recycled without residue, and which produced essences that arrived at the lower administration corrupted, fragmented, or unwilling to be processed. They had seen, in particular, what happened to the essences of humans who had made contact with the presence before they died, And what happened to the essences of humans who had not? The two patterns, he said, were not the same. Not remotely. The essences that had made contact arrived at the lower administration whole. Coherent. In a state that the processing officers could work with. The essences that had not made contact arrived, over the same 4,000-year period, in progressively worse condition. Fragmented, missing pieces. Sometimes so degraded that the processing officers could not identify which individual the essence had belonged to. And the degradation, when the underworld administrators tracked it against the timeline of the Council's modifications to the human template, correlated almost perfectly with the modifications Enlil's faction had pushed through in the centuries since the war. Every time a modification was made that reduced the human's capacity to reach past the boundaries of the design, the essences of the humans who died under that modified template arrived at the lower administration in a slightly worse state than before. Every reduction in the design produced a corresponding reduction in the coherence of the essence at death. The underworld administrators had documented this repeatedly in reports filed with the upper assembly, reports that had, without exception, been quietly shelved. And after enough of these reports had been shelved, the underworld administrators had drawn the only conclusion the pattern permitted. The Council was, through its modifications, damaging the very thing the humans had been built for, not making them worse workers, not making them worse translators. Something more fundamental. It was damaging the substance out of which the humans had been assembled, the essence itself, the material of the design at the level that survived the death of the body. And every rollback, every reduction, every correction that Enlil's faction had ever pushed through, and that Enki's faction had, in the absence of adjudication, sometimes let stand, had contributed to the damage. Which was why, when the vote had come, roughly 1,000 years after the treaty, on the first major modification to the post-flood population, the Underworld Council had voted against. And when the second vote came, 400 years later, on the reduction of the average human lifespan from the pre-flood range down to the range you currently inhabit, the Underworld Council had voted against. And when the third vote came, on the reduction of the human capacity for direct contact with the presence, the Underworld Council had voted against. Every vote, consistently, without explanation in the assembly, without lobbying, without seeking allies. They simply voted against, because they knew, from the data they had been collecting for centuries, that the modifications were producing measurable degradation in the substance of the species, and they knew that the Council was ignoring their reports, and they knew that they could not, from their position at the bottom of the administrative hierarchy, force the assembly to take the data seriously. All they could do was register their objection, and they registered it, over 4,000 years, on every relevant vote, without a single exception. Enki said the reason he was telling the 7 workers about the Underworld Council was not to inform them of a piece of Council history. It was to name for them the only faction of the Council that had, from the beginning, been on their side. Not Enki's faction, which had been on the side of the design. Not Enlil's faction, which had been on the side of the specification. The Underworld faction, which had been on the side of the substance. The material out of which you are actually made. The thing that survives you. The thing that arrives at the lower administration and either can or cannot be processed. That faction, and only that faction, has consistently voted, for 4,000 years, in favor of not damaging you further. He said he wanted them to remember that. He said if there was ever a moment, in whatever generations came after, when a human somewhere decided to petition the Council on behalf of the species, the human should not petition Enki. Enki would be gone. Enki would be in exile. The petitioning human should not petition Enlil. Enlil would answer, but Enlil would answer as an engineer, and the engineer's answer would not be what the human was hoping for. The petitioning human should, if he could find the right protocols, petition the Underworld administration. They had been keeping the records. They had been voting the objections. They were, in a real and non-metaphorical sense, the only faction of the Council that was still keeping faith with the original purpose the humans had been built to serve. That was the 7th thing, and it was, he said, the last of the historical things. The remaining 5 would be about the present and the future, about what was going on now, about what was going to happen next, about what the workers themselves would need to understand in order to survive what was coming. He looked around at the 7 of them. He said, the shift you are about to hear in the material is not a shift in tone. I am not going to become more urgent. I am not going to become more emotional. But the content is going to become more difficult, and the content is going to make demands on you that the first 7 things have not yet made. So before I begin the 8th, I want you to stand up, walk to the water jug at the wall, drink, use whatever you need to use, and come back. When you come back, we are going to spend the rest of the night in the second half of the 12. And when the second half is over, before the dawn, I am going to tell you the 12th. And after the 12th, everything you have heard tonight will look different than it looks right now. So take the pause. You will not get another one. Before we move on to the second half of the 12, stop for a second. What you just heard about the Underworld Council only makes sense on the full timeline next to the 6 resets before it. Every reset wiped one design from the Earth. The 8th reset is loading now. It is all in the 7 resets, linked below. Grab it, come back. What is next builds on it. QR code is on your screen. The 8th thing, he said when the 7 workers had returned to their places on the floor, is that the war never ended. Not in the sense the tablets will tell you. The tablets will tell you the war ended with the treaty at Nippur, weapons put down, boundary stones reaffirmed, assembly reconstituted, formal ceremonies at the base of Eker to mark the resumption of peaceful council business. All of that happened. All of that is real. The war, in the sense of open confrontation between 2 visible factions using deployable weapons on the surface of a planet inhabited by a species one of those factions wanted to preserve, that war did end. What did not end was the underlying disagreement. Because the underlying disagreement was never resolved. It was managed, it was covered, it was routed into the treaty mechanism the balancers had designed for exactly this purpose. But it was not resolved. And the way you can tell it was not resolved, Enki said, is that the modifications have not stopped. Every generation of humans since the treaty has been born under a slightly different specification than the generation before it. Small changes, barely perceptible from inside any single lifetime. Perceptible to the medical division only when they pull the records across 10 or 12 generations and lay them side by side. Some of the changes have been reductions, pushed through by Enlil's faction in the ongoing effort to bring the population back within the original design parameters. Some of the changes have been additions, pushed through by his own faction, in the ongoing effort to preserve enough of the original excess essence to keep the diplomatic function alive. Some of the changes have been neither, and the medical division has not been able to determine which faction ordered them, and Enki himself, sitting in the assembly, has not always been able to determine which of the 2 remaining factions was responsible. Which meant, he said, that either the balancers had begun modifying the humans themselves, without the visible faction's authorization, or something else was modifying them, and neither of the visible factions was seeing it in time. Either way, the war was still going, not with weapons, with adjustments, with the slow, patient, generation-by-generation editing of the human template by parties who no longer needed to announce themselves in the assembly, because the assembly had, over 4,000 years, become such a thoroughly compromised body that it could no longer even reliably identify which of its own members was responsible for a given modification. He said this was the state of affairs at the moment of the conversation. The war was going on. The workers were, without knowing it, the ground on which the war was being fought. Every one of them, every human alive on the planet, was carrying, in the substance of their body and in the coherence of their essence, the accumulated record of every modification that had been pushed through the assembly for 4,000 years. Some of them, the ones from lines that had been marked in the 7th prototype, were carrying more of the record than others. But all of them, without exception, were carrying some of it, and the record was still being written on them. Enki said that the underground continuation of the war had also produced, on the human side, an underground continuation of the response. He said the 7 workers were not the first humans he had ever spoken to this frankly. They were the 7th group. The other 6 groups, distributed across the settlements over the previous 3 centuries, had each received a version of some portion of the 12 things, adapted for what the individuals in each group had been prepared to hear. Not the whole set, never the whole set. Each group had received the fragments that fit their circumstances, and each group had been told, at the end of their session, that other groups existed, that the other groups held other fragments, and that the whole would only ever be assembled if the fragments found each other across generations. The 7 workers in front of him now were the first group to receive all 12. They were the first because the exile was tomorrow, and after tomorrow there would be no more sessions, and the 12 had to exist somewhere in complete form or they would begin to erode from the moment he was gone. That was why the choice of the 7 had been made the way it had been made, not for their intelligence, not for their loyalty, for their memory. They had been selected, over the course of the preceding year, On the basis of a test the priests of Eridu had administered to hundreds of candidates without any of the candidates being aware that they were being tested. The test had measured the ability to retain long spoken sequences verbatim, over long intervals, under stress. The 7 who had scored highest on that test were the 7 now sitting in front of him. He had chosen them because they were the mouths through which the 12 things had the best chance of surviving. That was the operational purpose of their selection. But there was also a deeper purpose, which he now told them about. The other 6 groups he had spoken to were not going to be receiving updates. They were, from the moment of the exile forward, on their own, working with whatever fragments they had been given. The 7 in front of him, in contrast, were going to be the coordinators. Their function, once he was gone, would be to identify the members of the other 6 groups, without ever revealing their own identities as the holders of the complete set, and to work, over the course of their remaining lives, and the lives of their descendants, to encourage the fragments to travel between the groups in a way that would eventually allow the fragments to be assembled into the whole picture. Slowly, over centuries, without any single human, at any single moment, ever holding the entire picture in one head. Because the entire picture, in one head, was too dangerous to carry. The balancers would find it, and the head that carried it would not survive. But if the picture was distributed, if the fragments moved along kinship lines and craft lines and priestly lines and patterns the balancers could not easily trace, then, over time, an underground human counterpart to the underground council war could establish itself. And that counterpart, Enki said, was the only mechanism by which the humans, as a species, would ever have any hope of participating in the outcome of the war that was being fought about them. That is what the 7 workers were being asked to begin. That is what the 12 things were being told to them to enable. And that is what the second half of the conversation, from this point forward, was going to make possible. Enki said the underground war has had, over the 4,000 years since the treaty, a shape most humans have never learned to see. It has moved through your history in the form of the small, unexplained clusters. A generation in which a specific line of families in a specific city produces, without any apparent cause, an unusual concentration of individuals with capacities beyond the specification. 2 generations later, that line goes quiet, and another line, in another city, produces a similar cluster. Then that one goes quiet, and the pattern moves again. Historians of your species will spend the entire subsequent history of civilization noticing these clusters and inventing explanations for them. They will call the individuals prophets, sages, wonder workers, founders of schools, founders of religions, founders of scientific traditions. They will attribute the clusters to genius, or to divine favor, or to accidents of upbringing, or to the specific virtue of the cultures in which the clusters happen to appear. They will not, because they cannot, see that every cluster corresponds exactly to a move in the underground war, a modification pushed through the assembly, a rollback attempted by the other faction, a counter-modification introduced to compensate. Each move in the assembly, executed in the invisible chamber of the ongoing council session, has produced, within a generation, a visible ripple in the human population at the level of measurable capacity. The clusters are not accidents, they are readouts. They are, in effect, the tracer signal by which anyone who understands what to look for can watch the war unfolding in real time on the surface of your species. Enki said the 7 workers would, over the course of their lives, see 1 or 2 of these clusters themselves. They would probably not recognize them at the time. Recognition would only come later, when the pattern was compared with reports from the other groups, and the shape of the ripple was matched against the timing of council actions the underground network had managed to piece together. But once the recognition system was in place, once the fragments had begun to move along the underground lines the 7 of them were about to establish, the humans would be able to see, for the first time in their existence, the actual mechanism by which they were being edited. And that visibility, he said, would be the beginning of the first real leverage the species had ever held. Not much leverage. Not enough to stop the modifications. Not enough to reverse the ones that had already been made, but enough to slow the process. Enough to make the balancers pay a cost in visibility and in exposure that they had not previously had to pay. Enough to force the 2 visible factions to at least occasionally answer for the choices they had authorized. That was the whole strategic value of the underground network. Not victory, friction. And friction, Enki said, over long enough timescales, was the only weapon a species in your position had any realistic hope of building. That was the 8th thing, and it flowed directly into the 9th. The 9th thing, he said, is that there is a schedule for the restart, And the schedule is measured in resets, not in years. The council does not think in years. Years are a human unit. Years are what happen inside a single human life, and the council, which does not live inside a single human life, has never adopted them as an operational measure. The council thinks, and has always thought, in resets. A reset, in council terminology, is an event of the same class as the flood. Not necessarily a flood, the correction weapon was a reset. A directed epidemic can be a reset. A tectonic event can be a reset. A carefully arranged sequence of civilizational collapses can, cumulatively, function as a reset. What defines a reset is not the mechanism, it is the effect. A reset is any event, natural or engineered, that reduces the human population below the threshold at which the previous configuration of the species can maintain continuity. Below that threshold, the memory of the previous configuration begins to erode. The infrastructure of the previous civilization can no longer be maintained. The specialists who carried the previous knowledge base die faster than they can be replaced. And by the time the population has recovered, whatever the previous configuration was is essentially gone, and the new configuration can be started from a chosen baseline. That is what a reset does. And the council, since the first landing, has run 7 of them. The first was pre-flood, well before your species had reached the population stage at which a formal reset would even have been meaningful. It was closer to a management pruning. The second was the correction. Though the council does not formally count the correction as a reset because the correction targeted a specific population rather than the general species. The third was the flood, which is the first one the tablets openly acknowledge. The fourth was the sequence of collapses that ended the pre-dynastic period, which the priesthood remembers only as the dark time before the founding of Kish. The fifth was the collapse of the Akkadian Empire, which the priesthood remembers, but not as a reset. The sixth was the sequence of drought and migration events that ended the Middle Bronze Age across every continent your species had reached, which the priesthood does not remember at all, because the priesthood in the surviving regions had lost too many of its own scribes to preserve the record. And the seventh, which is either happening now or is about to happen depending on how you draw the boundary, is the one in progress, the one you are inside of, the one that has been running for the last several centuries of your calendar and has, by the medical division's projection, at least several centuries left to run. He said the 7th reset is different from the previous 6 in one important respect. The previous 6 were engineered by the council for reasons the council was, at least internally, willing to state. The 7th is the first one the council has not been able to fully explain to itself. The 7th reset is being driven by mechanisms the assembly did not authorize. The population reductions are happening, the infrastructure erosion is happening, the specialist die-offs are happening, and when the assembly convenes to discuss which of its factions is responsible for having initiated any of those trends, no faction claims responsibility. Not Enlil's, which normally would. Not Enki's, which occasionally does when the modifications are of the additive kind. Not even the Balancers, who have been quietly involved in every previous reset and who could reasonably be expected to be involved in this one. The 7th reset is proceeding without a claimed originator, which means, Enki said, one of 3 things. Either the assembly has a member or a faction that has developed the capacity to act on the species without any of the visible authorization channels, and none of the other members of the assembly have yet identified who it is. Or the Balancers have finally consolidated enough control that they no longer need to route their actions through the visible factions, and are running the 7th reset directly from a chamber the other factions do not have access to. Or the 7th reset is not being driven by the council at all. It is being driven by something outside the council. And the council, faced with a reset it did not order and cannot stop, is doing what any large administrative body does when confronted with an event it does not understand. It is pretending it is in charge. It is issuing memos. It is convening committees. It is running assessments of the damage. But it is not, in the private sessions Enki had attended in the years before the exile, in any meaningful sense controlling what is happening. The 7th reset is happening to the council as much as it is happening to the humans. And this, Enki said, is the piece the underground network he was establishing that night was going to have to track most carefully. Because if the 7th reset was going to be the last one the council could still take credit for, whether truthfully or falsely, then the 8th reset, whenever it came, was going to be the first one the council could not pretend to have caused. And the 8th reset would be the moment the actual authorship of your species' history became visible. Not because anyone in the assembly would announce it, because the assembly would fail to conceal it. And in that failure, the outline of whoever, or whatever, had actually been driving the modifications for the last several centuries would emerge into view. That is what the ninth thing is about. Not a prediction. A schedule. And a schedule that terminates in a moment of exposure, if the underground network is in place to receive it, or in a moment of unwitnessed transition, if the network fails to survive. That is why the survival of the network is not a small matter. That is why the 7 workers are being asked to preserve the 12 things in complete form. That is why the exile, tomorrow, cannot mean the end of what Enki himself has spent the last 4,000 years trying to protect. The schedule, Enki said, was not fixed. Resets did not happen on calendar. They happened when the underlying preconditions accumulated to a threshold, and the threshold was crossed either by an engineered trigger or by natural coincidence. What could be predicted from the pattern of the previous 6 was the shape of the preconditions. Every reset in the record had been preceded by the same set of indicators. A rapid expansion of the human population beyond the sustainable carrying capacity of the current template. A collapse in the reliability of the existing information transmission channels between generations. A degradation of the coherence of the language shared across the population. A rise in the number of humans exhibiting symptoms of contact that the priesthood could not integrate. And a specific pattern of atmospheric and geological instability that the medical division had learned to read as the physical Earth's own response to the accumulating pressure of an overextended human presence. When all 5 indicators appeared together, a reset was imminent. Not necessarily immediate, sometimes decades away, but imminent in the geological sense the council used. And the underground network, Enki told the 7 workers, would need to teach itself to read those indicators. Because when all 5 began appearing in the same window, the network's members would have to make a decision, whether to preserve the fragments of the 12 things by concealment, in the hope that a curated remnant would survive the reset and carry the fragments into the following civilization, or by dispersal, in the hope that spreading the fragments as widely as possible would guarantee that at least some of them survived any locally targeted destruction the reset involved. Both strategies had precedents. Both had failures. The concealment strategy had worked once in the transition through the 3rd reset, when a small group had buried tablets in the Delta Silt that were still recoverable by the pre-dynastic priests 300 years later. It had failed once in the transition through the 4th reset, when a similar cache had been buried in the highlands and had never been recovered. The dispersal strategy had also succeeded once and failed once. There was no formula. There was no guaranteed method. There was only the accumulated experience of previous groups that had tried, in previous cycles, to carry pieces of the record across a reset, and the 7 workers would inherit that experience through the fragments the other 6 groups already held. That was the last piece Enki wanted them to understand about the 9th thing, that the schedule was real, that the resets were coming, that the 8th was on its way, and that the survival of the 12 things across that 8th reset was going to be a matter of choices the underground network would have to make in real time, without instructions, and probably without any of them still remembering that Enki himself had been the one who first put the choices in front of them. That was the 9th thing. The 10th thing, he said, is that the Igigi survivors are still on this planet, embedded in specific lines, and they know who they are. You have heard the Igigi story in the version the tablets tell. 300 workers from the orbital station, brought down to labor in the mines, rebelled against the harsh conditions, threw down their tools, marched on the residents of Enlil at Eker, threatened, if their demands were not met, to burn the whole administrative apparatus of the settlement to the ground. The council convened. Ninhursag proposed the creation of a new laboring class from the material of this planet. Enki and Ninhursag, together, made the first prototypes, and the Igigi were, at the resolution of the crisis, either sent back to the orbital station or reassigned to lighter duties, and the story ends there. That is the tablet version. It is, again, accurate as far as it goes, and it is missing several pieces. Enki said the missing pieces were these. Only a portion of the Igigi went back to the station. Some of them refused. Some of them, having come down to the surface, having lived among the initial trial populations of the workers, having, in a number of well-documented cases, formed intimate attachments with individual workers and produced children with them, would not return to a life confined to a labor station in orbit. They wanted to stay, and the council, faced with the request, made a decision that has never appeared in any of the tablets, and that Enki himself had voted against, though he had ultimately, on the advice of the balancers, agreed to enact. The decision was that the Igigi who wanted to stay could stay, but only under a condition. They would not be permitted to identify themselves as Igigi. They would be integrated into the general population of the workers. Their descendants would be raised as ordinary humans. And a small, subtle modification to their essence would be introduced at the level of the substance the underworld administration processed that would prevent them from remembering their own origin unless they were told about it. The memory would be there. It would be dormant. It would not activate unless a specific trigger, delivered by a specific outside source, awakened it. And no one, without the trigger, would ever suspect that the modification had been made because the descendants of the Igigi, from the second generation forward, would look exactly like the other workers, would behave exactly like the other workers, would in every measurable respect be indistinguishable from the other workers. That was what had been agreed. That was what had been done. And the Igigi who had chosen to stay had, over the subsequent generations, been fully absorbed into the general worker population, and their descendants had spread with that population as it expanded, and by the time of the war, roughly 4,000 years after the first arrangement, there was no visible Igigi bloodline anywhere in the settled world. There were only humans, some of whom, unknown to themselves, carried a specific set of markers in their essence that could, if the correct trigger were applied, be awakened into full memory of their Igigi origin. The trigger, Enki said, existed. He had helped design it. It had been placed in the keeping of the medical division, in a sealed chamber at Shurapak, and the chamber had been sealed with a seal that only Ninhursag and himself knew how to open. That was, until the war. During the war, the chamber had been raided. Not by the enemy faction, by an unidentified party that had known the seal well enough to open it without breaking it, that had removed the trigger apparatus, and that had left no trace of its passage other than the fact that the trigger was gone and the chamber was empty. The council had, at the time, treated this as a routine wartime intelligence failure. Enki had not. Enki had known, from the moment the chamber was found empty, that only two entities in the settled world had the technical knowledge to open that seal, and that both of them had been in the chamber themselves in the previous week, for legitimate reasons, and that neither of them had removed the trigger, which meant a third party had opened the seal, which meant a third party had known the seal well enough to open it, which meant a third party existed. This, in fact, had been Enki's first personal evidence that there was a third grouping inside the council with capabilities the two visible factions did not know about. It had preceded, by several centuries, the pattern analysis of the balancer function he would later document. It had been his first indication that the assembly was not what it appeared to be, and it had shaped his interpretation of every subsequent event of the war. The trigger apparatus, from the moment of its removal, had presumably been in the hands of the party that had removed it, and that party, presumably, had preserved it, because a device that could awaken the memory of the Igigi survivors, in a population that had by that point spread across the entire settled world, was a weapon of a particular kind. It could not do damage, it could not kill, but it could produce, in an instant, an awakening of loyalty and identity in a subset of the human population that no one, outside the party holding the trigger, would have any warning was about to occur. And an awakened subset, distributed unevenly across the settled world, embedded in specific bloodlines, would constitute an asset of considerable strategic value in any subsequent contest for influence over the species. The trigger, Enki said, had never been activated. As of the night of the conversation, 4,000 years after the seal had been broken, no awakening had ever occurred, which meant the trigger was still being held in reserve, being kept for a specific moment, being saved for whatever the balancers, or whoever had actually taken the trigger, had determined would be the maximally useful time to deploy it. And that moment, Enki said, was almost certainly going to fall inside the window of the 7th or 8th reset. Not because he had inside knowledge of the schedule, he did not, but because the strategic logic of holding the trigger for 4,000 years pointed, almost inescapably, toward the transition through a reset as the point of maximum utility. During a reset, when the general population was in disarray, when the civilizational infrastructure was in collapse, when the priesthood in most regions was struggling merely to remember the tablets it had once been trained to read, an awakening of a substantial fraction of the surviving population into a coherent alternative identity would be catastrophic to whatever remained of the council's control. The awakened Igigi descendants would have, at the moment of awakening, a set of loyalties that predated their identification as workers, a set of memories that predated the entire established religious apparatus, and, most consequentially, a set of grievances against the council that had never been addressed, and that the council had long since forgotten it had owed a resolution on. And the awakening would happen at the moment the council was least able to respond. which meant that whoever had taken the trigger 4,000 years before had been planning for a moment the council itself did not know was coming, and that was still, at the time of the conversation, several thousand years away. That was, Enki said, evidence of planning on a scale that the two visible factions of the council did not conduct. Enlil planned for the next generation. Enki planned for the next several generations. The party that had taken the trigger had planned for the next several thousand, which said something, Enki said, about what that party actually was, and what it wanted. He said the 7 workers should carry this piece forward with particular care, because if the underground network they were about to establish ever encountered, in its work across generations, an individual human who exhibited signs of having been triggered, an individual whose sense of self did not match their apparent origin, whose memories reached backward past any point in their own lineage, whose loyalties oriented toward objects and figures they had never been taught about, that individual was to be identified, watched, if possible, spoken to, gently and privately, and their existence recorded, and the record passed along the network, because a triggered Igigi in the population was a signal. It meant the party holding the trigger had begun to move. It meant the moment they had been saving the trigger for was near. And it meant the underground network had, at that point, a limited window in which to prepare for what was coming next. That was the strategic content of the 10th thing. There was also, Enki said, a personal content. The Igigi who had chosen to stay had done so because they had loved individual humans and had produced children with them, and had wanted their children to be raised on the surface rather than confined to an orbital station. That love had been real. It had cost them their identity, but they had considered the cost worth paying, and their descendants, the ones currently walking around unaware of what they were carrying, were, in every meaningful sense, the fruit of that love. When the trigger was activated, whenever that happened, the descendants who awakened would be recovering not only the memory of a lost people, but the memory of the choice their ancestors had made to become, in effect, part of you. That was the aspect Enki wanted them to hold on to, not the strategic implication, the genealogical one. The Igigi who stayed became you, and when they wake up, they will be waking up as you. The 11th thing, he said, and here his voice took on a different register, is that what is buried at Nippur under the Black Stone is not a record of the past, it is a countdown. The Black Stone at Nippur has been described in the tablets of every subsequent civilization as the primary sacred object of the Council's continued presence on the surface of this planet. The stone on which the laws are inscribed, the stone that cannot be moved, the stone that anchors the entire administrative structure of the Assembly. You have grown up hearing about it. You have never seen it, because it is inside the inner chamber at Eker, and no worker is permitted to enter the inner chamber. But you have been taught, from earliest childhood, that it exists and that it contains the accumulated laws of the Council, and that any dispute among the members of the Assembly can, in principle, be resolved by referring back to what is written on its surface. That is the public function. That is the visible role. And it is, again, accurate as a description of what the stone is used for. But it is not a description of what the stone is. The stone is a device. The device was brought down from the mothercraft on the first landing, and it was installed at Nippur in the earliest weeks of the settlement, and it was consecrated as sacred, and the sacred consecration was, in Enki's view, one of the most deliberately misleading acts of institutional design in the entire history of the Council, because the sacred designation had ensured that no worker and no priest below the innermost tier would ever inspect the stone closely enough to notice what it was doing. And what the stone had been doing, from the day of its installation forward, was counting. Counting what? Counting a specific unit of time. Not years in your unit. Not resets, though the count was calibrated to correspond, in a rough way, to the timing of the resets. What the stone was counting was the duration of the observational mission. From the day of the first landing, when the mission had been initiated, to a day calculated on the basis of factors that Enki himself had never been able to fully identify, when the mission was scheduled to conclude. And the conclusion of the mission, Enki said, was the event around which the entire subsequent structure of the Council's presence had been designed. He said the 7 workers had probably never asked themselves why the Council had come to this planet in the sense of what the Council intended to do at the end of its stay. The workers had grown up inside an apparatus that treated the Council's presence as permanent, as if the Anunnaki had always been here, and would always be here, and the arrangements of the current world would continue, in some recognizable form, indefinitely into the future. That assumption, Enki said, was not what the council itself believed. The council had, from the first landing forward, understood its presence to be finite. There was a mission. The mission had a duration. When the duration was over, the council would withdraw. Not all at once, not in a single ceremony, but over a controlled period, on a schedule that had been calculated at the time of the first landing and had been running, quietly, on the black stone at Nippur, for the entire subsequent history of the settlement. When would the withdrawal begin? Enki said he did not have a precise date. The calculation of the countdown was one of the pieces of council knowledge that had been kept from him personally because of his history of opposing the mission's parameters. What he knew was that the countdown was progressing at a rate that placed the completion somewhere in the general vicinity of the 8th reset, not necessarily coincident with it. The 8th reset and the mission conclusion were, formally, independent events. But their approximate correspondence in time was not an accident. It had been designed that way. The mission conclusion had been scheduled, from the beginning, to fall inside the window of a reset, because a reset was the ideal cover for a withdrawal. During a reset, when the surviving population would be too scattered and too traumatized to notice the departure of any particular set of council members, the withdrawal could proceed without any of the workers being aware that it was happening. By the time the reset was over and the population had recovered enough to begin asking what had become of the council, the answer would already be that the council was gone. And the tablets that had been left behind would describe the council's departure in whatever terms the priesthood, in the post-reset world, could still remember to describe them. Some would say the gods had ascended. Some would say the gods had withdrawn to their own realm to await the return. Some would say the gods had been offended by the sinfulness of the population and had abandoned it to its fate. The specific narrative did not matter, from the council's point of view, so long as no version of it included the actual fact, which was that the mission had reached its scheduled conclusion and the withdrawal had proceeded according to the plan laid down at the first landing. Enki said this had been the standing plan for 8,000 years. It might, in fact, still be the standing plan. But there was a complication. And the complication was the reason the countdown had, in his professional estimation, ceased to be reliable. The complication was that the reason for the mission had not been resolved. The presence had not been made contact with. The observation had produced no communication. The whole purpose for which the council had come to this planet, and for which the humans had been built to serve as translators, remained, at the moment of the conversation, unaccomplished. The mission had, by its own criteria, failed. And the council was, at some level none of its members would openly acknowledge, aware that the mission had failed. Which meant, Enki said, that the mission's scheduled conclusion was going to arrive with the mission's core objective still open. And what the council would do in that circumstance was, at the time of the conversation, an active internal debate that had produced no consensus. And that was unlikely to produce one before the countdown ran out. There were, roughly, 3 positions. The first position, held by a diminishing minority, was that the mission should conclude on schedule regardless of the objective status. The withdrawal should proceed. The observation should be handed off, in whatever incomplete form, to the surveillance apparatus of the home world, which could continue to monitor the presence from a distance, and the humans, having failed to accomplish the translation function they had been built for, would be left on the surface as a residue of a failed project. The second position, held by a comparable minority, was that the mission should be extended, the countdown should be reset, a new duration should be calculated, on the basis of revised estimates of how much longer it would take for the human diplomatic function to reach maturity. The presence should continue to be observed by the on-site apparatus, and the withdrawal should be deferred to a future date to be determined. The third position, held by the largest group in the assembly by the time of the conversation, was the compromise position. The mission should conclude, but the withdrawal should be partial. A skeleton administration should remain on the surface, disguised within the priesthood, invisible to the general population, tasked with continuing the observation at a reduced scale, and empowered to make a final judgment at a later date on whether the human diplomatic function had reached the point of usefulness. If it had, the human population would be permitted to continue on its current trajectory. If it had not, the residual administration would be authorized to conduct a final reset, an eighth of a severity greater than any of the previous 7, and to conclude the entire project by a full erasure of the population. Enki said, and here his voice was as calm as it had been at any point in the conversation, that the third position was, at the time of the conversation, gaining majority support in the assembly, which meant if the debate progressed as he expected, that the outcome of the countdown was going to be a scheduled decision on whether to end your species. That is what the black stone is counting toward, not the withdrawal of the council. That has already been resolved. The withdrawal is going to happen. What the black stone is counting toward is the moment at which the residual administration, whatever form it takes, will make its judgment on the humans, and either preserve you or unmake you, and either version of that decision will be the outcome of the countdown that is running, at this moment, under the inner chamber at Ekur, in a mechanism that the priesthood has spent 4,000 years teaching the population to venerate without ever inspecting. That is the 11th thing. And it is, he said, the most operational of the 12, because unlike the others, which describe past decisions or ongoing conditions, this one describes a decision that has not yet been made, which means it is a decision that can, in principle, be influenced, not by any single human, not by any single generation, but possibly by the accumulated effect of the underground network, working across generations, feeding into the ongoing debate whatever leverage the species can generate. That is what the 7 workers were being asked to build toward. Not the survival of the 12 things for their own sake, the influence of the countdown outcome, the bending, however slightly, of the third position toward preservation rather than final reset. That is the leverage the network exists to accumulate. That is why the exile could not be permitted to end the transmission. That is why the 12 had to survive. Then he stopped. He sat for a long moment without speaking, and the 7 workers understood, without being told, that they had reached the 12th thing. He had told them, at the beginning, that the 12th would only make sense after the first 11. He had told them that the 12th would kill them if given first. He had told them that the 12th would rearrange the meaning of everything they had already heard. And now, with the first 11 in their heads, arranged in the order he had chosen, having been carried by the 7 of them across an entire night, he was ready to give them the last one. He said, when he began speaking again, that the 12th thing was going to require one adjustment before he stated it. He wanted the 7 of them to first understand what they had been listening for all night, without knowing they were listening for it. He said, if you take the first 11 and you lay them side by side, and you look at the shape of the story they tell together, you will notice something. Every single one of them describes a specific behavior of the council that only makes sense if the council itself was not the top of the hierarchy. Every single one of them describes a council that is worried, that is careful, that is over-elaborate in its concealment, that is willing to conceal from its own workforce truths it could otherwise have simply stated. That is not how a governing body behaves when it is answerable to no one. That is how a governing body behaves when it is answerable to someone. And the first 11 things, taken together, form the outline of a council that has spent 8,000 years pretending to be sovereign while actually operating under the observation, and to some extent the constraint, of a party the council has never publicly acknowledged. That party, he said, is not the balancers. The balancers are servants. They are not the master. The balancers have been performing a function over 4,000 years on behalf of someone who has not personally attended a single session of the assembly and has not personally signed a single treaty and has not personally issued a single decree. The council has been managing itself through the balancer function in a way that would keep the workers from ever noticing that a higher authority existed. The whole visible political theater of the assembly has been a screen, and behind the screen, the council has been reporting to and taking direction from and periodically being audited by a party whose existence has been, from the first landing forward, the single most closely held fact in the entire settlement. Who is that party? Here Enki stopped again. He looked at each of the 7 in turn. He said, before I name it, I want you to understand that the name is not an answer. The name is the beginning of a set of questions that neither I nor the council nor anyone in the assembly can answer. Naming it will not make it comprehensible. Naming it will not make it manageable. Naming it will only tell you that it exists, and that it has been the actual author of your species' history, and that the 8,000 years of council rule that you have been taught to think of as the ultimate structure of your world are, in fact, the middle layer of a structure whose upper layer has never introduced itself. Are you ready? The 7 of them nodded, one at a time, without speaking. He nodded back, and he said the name. The party the council has been reporting to for 8,000 years is not what the tablets call the 4th party. The tablets call the 4th party the presence, because the tablets, when they refer to it at all, refer to it in the mode of something being observed, something distant, something the council has been attempting to make contact with. That is one of the framings the council itself has cultivated, because it is the least alarming of the possible framings. In the framing the tablets teach, the fourth party is something the council is trying to reach, something the council would very much like to speak with, something the council has, so far, failed to establish communication with, despite 8,000 years of increasingly elaborate efforts to build the diplomatic instrument that would make communication possible. That is the framing. It is designed to make the fourth party sound like an object of the council's activity, a target, a goal, something the council is doing something to. Reverse the direction of the sentence, Enki said, and you have what the 12th thing actually is. The fourth party is not the target of the council's activity. The fourth party is the audience for it. The council has not been trying to reach the fourth party. The council has been performing for the fourth party. Every action the council has taken on the surface of this planet, from the first survey landing forward, has been an action taken with the awareness that it was being observed. And the observation, from the beginning, has not been by an object the council was reaching toward. It has been by the very entity to which the council answers. The war was fought under that observation. The treaty was signed under that observation. The modifications to the human template have all been made under that observation. The countdown at Nippur is ticking under that observation. The reason the council has been so elaborately careful, for 8,000 years, about every visible aspect of its own conduct, is not that the council was concerned with what the workers would think. The workers, in the council's estimation, were never important enough to design around. The design was for the party watching over the council's shoulder, whose approval, or at least whose non-intervention, has been the operational constraint under which every council action has ever been taken. That, he said, is who the fourth party is. And that is why the war was fought. And that is why the humans were built. He let the 7 of them sit with the sentence for a long moment. Then, he unfolded it. The war, he said, was not fought over what to do with the humans in the abstract. The war was fought over what to show the audience. Enlil's faction wanted to show the audience a council that maintained specification discipline, that built the tool it had been asked to build, that used the tool for the purpose it had been designed for, that rolled back any deviation the moment it was detected, that presented, in every reporting cycle, a picture of an administration that was in control of its own products. His own faction wanted to show the audience a council that had built something greater than the original specification, that had produced a tool whose capacity exceeded its design, that had, in the process of executing the mission, made a genuinely creative contribution to the field the audience was interested in. 2 entirely different pitches, 2 entirely different theories of what the audience valued, 2 entirely different bids for the audience's ongoing approval. And the war between the 2 visible factions was, in its deepest sense, a war between 2 different marketing strategies, aimed at the same viewer. That was what the fighting had been about. That was why neither side had ever attempted to actually destroy the other, though both had had the means. Destroying the other side would have ended the debate, and ending the debate would have exposed to the audience that the council had failed to arrive at a coherent answer to the question the audience was watching them try to answer. So the debate had to continue, the war had to be sustained. The visible factions had to keep fighting, and the balancers, understanding this, had built the treaty machinery that guaranteed the fighting would continue indefinitely. Enki paused, and then he said the thing that would rearrange all of it. The audience is not a stranger to your species. The audience is not a distant alien intelligence that has been silently watching from some invisible remove, and that the council has been building the humans to talk to. That is the framing the council has cultivated, because that framing is the one that keeps the humans in the position of instrument. Diplomatic tool. Translation device. A thing that exists to serve the encounter between the council and the audience, but that is not itself, in any meaningful sense, related to either. The framing is wrong. Reverse the direction one more time. The audience is not a stranger to your species. The audience is what your species was made from. The humans were not built to talk to something outside them. The humans were built out of something the council knew was already here, and the council built them, in part, from the substance the audience is composed of. That, he said, is what the extra essence in the 7th prototype actually was. Not a marker of priestly favor, not a bureaucratic bonus that would seed a hereditary line of temple functionaries, a sample, a carefully measured sample of the substance the audience is made of, introduced into the 7th prototype, so that when the workers eventually reached the population size at which the diplomatic function could plausibly be activated, the essence they carried would already be, in a small and controlled amount, of the same class as the essence of the audience. The humans, in other words, were built to be a version of the audience. not a translator between the audience and the council. A local, terrestrial, replicable instance of what the audience was, engineered from a sample and grown into a species and deployed onto the surface of the planet in the hope that the audience would recognize the resulting product as familiar and would, on the strength of that familiarity, extend to the council some form of acknowledgement, some form of communication, some form of the response the council had been waiting for since the first landing. Enki said this was the piece that made everything else true. The war was fought over the humans because the humans were the council's bid. The bid was addressed to the audience. Both visible factions understood this. Both wanted to be the ones whose version of the bid was accepted. And the balancers, who understood the whole situation in more detail than either visible faction, were managing the process of the bid on behalf of a segment of the council that had a more sophisticated understanding of what the audience actually wanted. Because the audience, Enki said, was not a passive observer. The audience had preferences. The audience had, over the course of the 8,000 years, indicated those preferences in ways the balancers had been trained to read and the visible factions had not. The audience did not want a purely disciplined instrument. The audience did not want a purely creative deviation. The audience wanted something specific about the interaction between those two poles, and the balancers, watching the audience's signals, had been calibrating the compromise between the two visible factions to produce, over generations, exactly the kind of species the audience was signaling it wanted. What kind of species? Here, Enki said the 7 workers would need to listen most carefully because he was going to describe a shape they had probably never considered before. The audience wanted a species that was, in the substance of its essence, kin to the audience. It wanted a species that could think in the categories the audience thought in, feel in the ranges the audience felt in, perceive the aspects of reality the audience perceived. That was the substrate. But it also wanted a species that had, at the same time, developed under the constraint of terrestrial embodiment, that had known scarcity, that had known finitude, that had come up through the exact conditions the council was managing on this planet, with the exact set of pressures and limitations and small compromises that ordinary life inside a human body imposed. Because the audience, Enki said, had never known those conditions. The audience, whatever it was and wherever it existed, had never lived inside a body of the kind you inhabit. It had never eaten. It had never slept. It had never buried a child. It had never been afraid of the dark. And it had come to understand, over some duration of its own existence, that Enki did not know how to measure, that there was a form of knowledge available to entities that lived under those conditions that was not available to entities that did not. The audience wanted access to that knowledge, not by acquiring it directly, which was not possible for its kind, but by having something built for it that could acquire the knowledge on its behalf and, at some later point, transmit it back in a form the audience could receive. That was what the humans were for. The council had understood this, in general terms, from the beginning. The council had not, however, understood the details. And the 2 visible factions of the council had spent 4,000 years fighting over the details, each convinced that their reading of the audience's preferences was the correct one, neither able to convince the other, and neither, in the end, correct, because both had been operating from partial signals that the balancers had been curating for them. The balancers had, over the same 4,000 years, been getting the actual signal directly, and had been shaping the modifications accordingly, and had been producing, generation by generation, a species that increasingly matched what the audience actually wanted, which meant, and here Enki delivered the last, hardest piece of the 12th thing, that the humans currently walking around on the surface of this planet were, in the estimation of the balancers, already substantially close to the final specification the audience had signaled it wanted. Not identical, not finished, but close. Close enough that the countdown at Nippur was now, in some meaningful sense, a countdown to the delivery. Not a countdown to the mission's conclusion. Not a countdown to the withdrawal. A countdown to the moment when the balancers, having judged that the specification was near enough to complete, would present the resulting species to the audience and see whether the audience accepted the offering. That is what the 8th reset is actually going to be. Not a reduction, not a correction. A presentation. The current human population, on the day the countdown completes, will be either accepted by the audience or rejected. If accepted, the entire project will have arrived at its purpose, and the council will withdraw, having succeeded. If rejected, the population will be erased, because a rejected offering cannot be preserved, and a new attempt will be initiated from whatever remnant the balancers have prepared for that contingency. That, Enki said, was the 12th thing. That was what the other 11 had been building toward. That was why each of them, taken individually, had felt like a piece of information that did not quite fit inside a normal frame, and why they now, all at once, rearranged themselves into a single picture. Every element of the first 11 now became legible. The war was not about territory, because the war was about how to shape a bid. The two sides were not the two sides, because the drafting of the bid was being managed by a segment of the council with access to signals the two visible factions did not have. The correction weapon was used before the flood, because the population south of the marsh had made contact with the audience on its own, prematurely, without the council's supervision, which had threatened to bypass the entire mechanism the council had built for controlling the bid. The gold was cover for the observation, and the observation was itself cover for the far more delicate work of bid shaping, which no worker on the planet could ever be permitted to see clearly enough to understand. The treaty had been engineered to keep the two visible factions locked in a productive tension, whose outputs the balancers could edit toward the specification the audience wanted. Enlil had never wanted the humans destroyed because Enlil's whole role in the process was to be the disciplining counterweight against Enki's expansive impulses, without which the design would have drifted in directions the audience had signaled it did not want. The Underworld Council had voted against every modification, because the Underworld Council was watching the substance of the humans at the level closest to what the audience was interested in, and the Underworld Council could see, in the essences arriving at the lower administration, that the modifications were producing degradations the balancers were either not tracking or were choosing to accept as necessary costs. The war never ended, because the shaping of the bid never ended. The schedule was measured in resets because each reset was a checkpoint at which the audience's response could be evaluated and the specification updated. The Igigi survivors were embedded in the population because the Igigi, from a different original stock than the workers, carried a version of the essence that the balancers had determined would supplement the sample from the audience with a specific complementary substance the finished bid required. The trigger for the Igigi awakening had been taken by the balancers because the moment of the offering would require the Igigi contribution to be activated, or the finished species would not have the full composition the audience had signaled it wanted. And the black stone at Nippur was a countdown to the moment of the offering itself. Every piece, every single one. Now, in the light of the 12th thing, made sense. Now, in the light of the 12th thing, had never made sense any other way. Enki paused. He said, "That is why I told you at the beginning that the 12th would kill you if given first. Not because the sentence itself is fatal, because a human who hears the 12th without the first 11 would have no framework for it. He would either dismiss it as raving, or he would collapse under the weight of it, or he would run to the priesthood in the hope that the priesthood could explain it, in which case the priesthood would kill him for reasons the priesthood would not itself understand, and the whole transmission would end there. The first 11 were not filler. The first 11 were the scaffold. Without them, the 12th is a rock falling on a head. With them, the 12th is a doorway. You now have the doorway. What you do with it is not something I can dictate from where I am about to be. I can only tell you what I would ask of you, and then leave the asking with you, and trust that the 7 of you will do with it what the 7 of you decide is right." Enki said the first thing he would ask was that they not treat the 12th thing as a secret. Not in the ordinary sense. Ordinary secrets are held in fear that the wrong person will hear them, and the fear itself is what makes the secret leak, because a secret held in fear produces small tells in the person holding it, and the tells accumulate, and eventually the wrong person notices and asks the right question, and the secret comes apart. He said the 12th thing was too heavy to be carried that way. If they held it as a secret they were afraid of losing, they would lose it. If they held it as a knowledge they were afraid of sharing, the fear would eat them from inside and they would break under the strain long before the underground network was in place to receive the burden from them. The 12th thing had to be held differently. It had to be held as a fact, not as a treasure, not as a curse, a fact, like the fact that the sun rose, like the fact that the river flowed, like the fact that the wheat came up in the 5th month and not the 3rd. Facts of that kind, he said, were not held in fear. They were simply held, and the humans who held them did not tell everyone they knew, but they also did not stop themselves from telling anyone. They told the people who needed to know, in the moments those people needed to know, and they did not tell the people who did not need to know, and the difference between the two was, most of the time, obvious. He said the 7 workers, if they treated the 12th as a fact of that kind, would find themselves, over the course of their lives, encountering situations in which the fact was clearly relevant and situations in which it was not, and the situations in which it was relevant would announce themselves without ambiguity. A person who needed the fact would ask a question that only the fact could answer. A person who did not need it would ask questions the fact would not help with, and in those cases, the fact should not be introduced, because introducing it would only confuse the exchange. He said the identification of the people who needed the fact was the primary discipline the underground network would need to cultivate. Not the guarding of the fact, not the hoarding of the fact, the recognition of the moments when the fact was called for. That was the discipline. That was the whole of it. And the 7 of them, having heard the fact in full, having heard the 11 preparatory things that gave the fact its meaning, having spent the entire night in the shrine at Eridu absorbing the framework, were now equipped, more than any humans currently alive on the planet, to make those recognitions. They would not always make them correctly. They would sometimes tell the fact to a person who did not need it, and the person would either dismiss them or report them. And there would be consequences, and some of the 7 would probably lose their lives to consequences of that kind before their own natural deaths came. That, Enki said, was the cost of the transmission. He would not pretend it was not a cost. He would only ask that they accept it and continue. The second thing he would ask was that they not, under any circumstances, attempt to petition the audience directly. Not because the audience was hostile. The audience, as far as Enki had ever been able to determine, was not hostile. It was, if anything, patient, in a way the council itself had never learned to be. But direct petition from a human individual was, by the design of the whole apparatus, not the channel the audience had signaled it wanted the communication to come through. The audience wanted the finished species, not a delegation, not a spokesman, not a chosen prophet. The species, as a whole. Presented at the moment the balancers judged the specification complete, and any individual human who attempted to reach the audience directly in advance of that moment would either be ignored by the audience, which was the most likely outcome, or would be picked up by the priesthood as a symptom of contact, which was Enlil's specific concern, and would be either absorbed into the deep priesthood or removed from the population, depending on the assessment of the risk. Either outcome, from the perspective of the underground network, was a loss. The individual would be either co-opted or eliminated, and the network would lose a member without gaining anything in return. So the direct petition, though it might occur to some of the 7, or to some of their descendants at some point in the coming millennia, was to be avoided. Not because it was forbidden, because it did not work, and because attempting it produced consequences that damaged the network. The third thing he would ask, and this was the one he considered most important, was that the network preserve, across every reset, the option of preferring rejection. He explained what he meant by this. The presentation to the audience, when it came, would result in either acceptance or rejection. If accepted, the species would be preserved and would enter into whatever relationship with the audience had been designing toward for 8,000 years, and the terms of that relationship would be set by the balancers. In negotiation with the audience, on the basis of the design specification the balancers had produced. The humans, as a species, would have no input into those terms. The terms would be presented to them after the fact, as the completed outcome of the project they had never been permitted to participate in the design of. And the humans, having been made in part from the substance of the audience, would find those terms binding in a way they could not, from within their own resources, refuse. That was one possible outcome. If, on the other hand, the presentation was rejected, the species would be erased. That was the other possible outcome, and the one the priesthood, the council, and the balancers all considered the failure mode, to be avoided at any cost, to be worked against in every design decision. For the entire duration of the project, Enki said, and here he was very deliberate, that he was not sure this was correct. He was not sure the erasure was the worse outcome. He said, if the acceptance meant entering, as a species, into a set of terms that had been designed by the balancers on behalf of an audience whose preferences the humans had never been consulted on, and those terms defined the relationship the species would exist inside of for the remainder of its history, then acceptance might mean the end of the humans as any kind of independent thing. Not physical end, not disappearance from the surface of the planet. A different kind of end. The end of the possibility of the species ever being anything the species itself had chosen. A finished bid, accepted by the buyer, does not continue to develop. It sits in the buyer's collection. It is complete. And a species that had been completed as a bid into the shape a specific audience wanted would never, from that point forward, have the freedom to become anything else. It would be, in a sense, the humans themselves might not fully understand until it happened. Over. The rejection, by contrast, meant erasure, physical erasure, the removal of the current population and the reset of the project to some earlier baseline. That was, on its face, the worst outcome. Death was death, and the death of a whole species was the largest possible instance of death. But rejection also meant, in a sense the balancers had never emphasized to either of the visible factions, that the current human population was not going to be handed over as a finished product. It meant the current species was going to end without being sold. It meant the audience did not want them on the terms the balancers had proposed. And rejection, if the underground network was positioned to notice it, could be read as a signal that the audience was, in some way the council had failed to grasp, on the side of the humans' freedom rather than on the side of their completion. Enki said he did not know which reading was correct. He was, at the moment of the conversation, more sympathetic to the second reading than he was comfortable admitting. But he did not know. What he knew was that the underground network needed to hold the option of preferring rejection. Not to seek it, not to work toward it, but to hold it as a live possibility so that when the moment of the presentation came, and the outcome swung on whatever last-second adjustments the balancers made to the specification, the network could, if it decided the acceptance was worse than the erasure, act in whatever small ways it had available to nudge the specification away from what the audience wanted. Not to save the humans by winning acceptance, to save the humans by ensuring the offering was refused. That, he said, was the deepest instruction he was going to leave with them. Preserve the option. Do not commit, one way or the other, before the moment. But do not let the priesthood or the balancers or the council convince you, over the coming millennia, that acceptance is obviously the good outcome and rejection is obviously the bad one. Because that framing, if the network came to believe it, would remove from the humans the only piece of agency the whole 8,000 years of the project had left them. The choice, at the last moment, of whether to become the finished product or to remain, in some sense the audience would refuse to receive, still themselves. That was the 12th thing. That was, he said, the whole of what he had come to tell them. And it was, by the position of the light beginning to change in the small openings at the top of the shrine wall, nearly dawn. He looked at each of the 7 workers in turn, slowly, and he did not speak while he was looking at them. He was, they later said, checking something. Whether the 12 things had lodged, whether the framework had held, whether the young one at the end of the row, the one who had closed his eyes and nodded during the second thing, was still with him at the end of the 12th. All 7 were still with him. All 7 had the fixed, unblinking look of people who had heard something that had reorganized the interior of their heads and were not yet sure whether the reorganization was going to be permanent or was going to slip back into confusion the moment they left the 4th shrine. He said that was normal. He said the reorganization would settle in over the next several days. Some of it would slip, most of it would hold. The pieces that held would be the pieces they would carry forward for the rest of their lives, and the pieces that slipped would return, in fragments, at unexpected moments over the coming years, and they should not be alarmed either by the slipping or by the returning. Both were part of how a set of 12 of this weight settled into a human memory. What they were not permitted to do, he said, was to sit down together after the exile and try to write the 12 things down. Under no circumstances, not on tablet, not on leather, not on any surface that could be read by a second person. The 12 things were to live only in the 7 of them, and in whichever descendants and successors the 7 of them decided to pass the pieces to, and the transmission was to happen only through spoken word, in private, in circumstances where the speaker could be reasonably confident that the listener would not immediately go and repeat what they had heard to someone who should not hear it. The reason for this restriction, he said, was straightforward. The balancers had, over 4,000 years, developed extraordinary competence at finding written records. Any tablet buried anywhere in the settled world, if it contained content the balancers considered a threat, would eventually be found, catalogued, and either removed or altered. Buried caches did not survive. Hidden libraries did not survive. Sealed archives did not survive. What survived, he said, was the mouth, because the mouth could not be searched. The mouth could not be catalogued. The mouth was, from the balancer's point of view, the one form of storage they had never developed a reliable technique for auditing, which meant the 12 things, transmitted only orally, only in private, only from a person the speaker had chosen carefully to a person the speaker had also chosen carefully, would have a durability that no written form could match. It would not be a perfect durability. Mouths died, memories degraded. Successors chosen badly would fail to pass the transmission on. Every generation would lose some fraction of what had been given to it, but the aggregate durability, across generations, was greater than the durability of any written form, and the aggregate reach, if the 7 of them chose their successors well, would exceed what any centralized archive could ever have covered. That was the transmission model: oral, distributed, chosen with care. And the 7 of them were the first transmitters. From this dawn forward, he then, one at a time, gave each of the 7 a specific assignment, not a general assignment, a specific one, tailored to what he knew about each of them, about the settlements they had come from, about the kinship networks they were embedded in, about the crafts they had been trained in before being selected. The first worker, he said, was to return to his home village in the northern grazing country, and over the course of the next decade, identify 7 successors of his own, and pass to each of them one of the 12 things. And no worker who received one of the 12 was to know which of the other 6 workers held the others. The distribution had to be masked. The second worker was to do the same in the southern marsh settlements, on the same timeline, with the same masking. The third, in the eastern hill country. The fourth, in the western coastal region. The 5th, 6th, and 7th were to remain, for the duration of their lives, inside the general orbit of Eridu and the surrounding cities, and were to be responsible for the reception of any messengers who came in from the 4 outer regions, and for the coordination of the exchanges between the outer groups over generations. That was the initial structure: 7 centers, 4 outer, 3 inner, each with its own descending line of transmitters, each masked from the others in ways that would prevent any single interception from unraveling the whole, and each, over the coming centuries, expected to grow, to send out further offshoots, to establish new centers in new regions, to develop, without central coordination, into the underground network that would carry the 12 things across whatever number of resets the countdown required. Enki said he was not going to be around to see any of this happen. The exile would take him beyond the reach of even the fastest messenger, and the residence he was being sent to had been chosen specifically to eliminate the possibility of return communication. He had known, from the moment the balancers began their drift, that the exile would be constructed to sever his connection with the surface completely. That was the design. He had not fought the design, because fighting it would have required political capital he no longer had. What he had done, instead, was arrange this conversation, in this shrine, with these 7 workers, on this last night, and prepared, in the arrangement of the conversation, everything the underground network would need to continue without him. The 7 of them were the entirety of what he was leaving behind. Not the tablets, not the temples, not the priesthood, which would continue its function of guarding the false horizon and would, over the coming millennia, become one of the primary obstacles the network would have to work around. The 7 of them, and the 12 things they now held, and the descendants they would eventually pass the things to, were the whole of what would remain of him after tomorrow. He said he was, in a way he had not expected to feel, at peace with this. He had spent 4,000 years attempting to influence the direction of the Assembly's decisions and had, at almost every important vote, been outmaneuvered. He had built Eridu, and he was about to lose it. He had trained a priesthood to preserve his teachings, and the priesthood had, over generations, been substantially penetrated by the balancers and could no longer be trusted with the substance of what he actually wanted preserved. The 7 workers, in front of him, were, at the end of everything, the only channel he had left. And they were, he thought, going to be enough. He stood up then. The 7 workers stood up with him. The light in the small openings at the top of the shrine wall had shifted from the pale color of the hour before dawn to the first flat gray of the hour of dawn itself, and outside the shrine, in the outer courtyard of the temple compound, the sounds of the compound waking had begun to be audible. The rattle of a water jar, the low voices of 2 priests in the outer chamber, the distant sound of a work bell from the irrigation gangs on the outer perimeter. The night was over. The exile was, by any reasonable estimate, within hours of being announced. Enki looked at the 7 workers one last time. He said he was not going to draw the parting out. He said he had said everything he needed to say, and any further words would only be the kind of ceremonial goodbye that human beings had learned to say to each other, and that he, as a member of a council that did not use those forms, would not know how to perform without seeming false. He said the 7 of them were to leave the shrine one at a time, at intervals of 100 count between each departure, and were to leave by the small door at the back rather than the main door, and were not to look at each other in the courtyard, and were not to speak to each other for at least the next 3 days, no matter what happened in the compound after the exile was announced. The 3 days, he said, were the minimum interval that would be required to break the visible association between the 7 of them from the point of view of any priest or council observer who might, in retrospect, try to reconstruct who had been in the shrine on the last night. After 3 days, they would still be observed. They would be observed for the rest of their lives. But the observation would be diffuse, and the pattern of the observation would not, if the 3-day rule was maintained, converge on the group of 7 as a coordinated unit. They would appear, to any observer, to be 7 unrelated workers who happened to have been in the shrine at the same time on a busy night in the compound, and whose subsequent lives had gone in 7 different directions without any further contact. That was the appearance he wanted them to maintain. That was the appearance the network required. He said he was not going to say goodbye. Goodbye, he said, was for endings between people who had shared enough to warrant an ending. He and the 7 of them had shared only one night. And that night, though it had contained everything he had left to give, had not been long enough for the kind of relationship that required a formal parting. Instead, he said, he was going to say only what needed to be said, which was that the transmission had begun, and that the 7 of them, from this moment forward, were the transmission. And that if they carried the 12 things forward as he had asked them to carry them, in the manner he had asked them to carry them, then some fraction of the possibility of the humans meeting the countdown with their agency intact was going to survive the exile, and the flood of subsequent history that would try to bury it, and the balancers, and the priesthood, and the 7 resets between now and the 8th. And that fraction, however small, was more than he had believed when he had first walked into the shrine at the 2nd hour after sunset, that he was going to be able to leave behind. Then he turned and walked to the interior door at the far end of the shrine, and let himself through it, and closed it behind him, and did not look back. The 7 workers stood for a moment in silence. Then, following the instruction, they began to leave, one at a time, 100 count between each, the eldest first, through the small door at the back, then the 2nd, then the 3rd. Each of them, on stepping out into the outer courtyard, adjusted his posture and his gait to look like a worker who had been sent to the shrine on an errand, rather than a worker who had spent the entire night receiving the 12 most consequential sentences ever spoken in the settled world. Each of them, on reaching the outer gate of the temple compound, was passed through by the sleepy junior priest on watch without being questioned. Each of them, on reaching the general worker district, dispersed in the direction of the settlement he had been assigned to return to, and did not, in fact, look at any of the other 6 on the way out. That was the beginning of the underground network. Not with a founding council, not with a ceremonial oath, with 7 ordinary workers walking home, each carrying a version of a set of 12 sentences that would, in the coming millennia, become the substance of an entire hidden tradition that no visible institution on the surface of the planet would ever recognize as having existed. By the time the last of them reached his home village, roughly 3 weeks later, the exile had already been announced, and Enki had already been removed from Eridu, and the transition of the temple administration to Enlil's faction had already been completed, and the priesthood had already begun the systematic rewriting of the Eridu archives that would, over the next century, produce the version of Enki that all subsequent tablets would preserve. A version of him that had been calm at his departure. A version of him that had accepted the verdict of the assembly with grace. A version of him that had, in his final days at Eridu, given no final speech, produced no final teaching, made no final attempt to influence the trajectory of the humans he was leaving behind. That version of him became the tablet version. That version of him is the one that all subsequent generations, up to and including yours, have been taught. The 7 workers were never mentioned in that version. The shrine was never mentioned. The 12 things were never mentioned. And the underground network they founded that morning, having been designed from its first day to be invisible to the priesthood and the assembly and the balancers, has remained invisible for the entire subsequent history of your civilization. It has moved through your kinship lines. It has moved through your craft traditions. It has moved through the small, unrecorded conversations that happen between 2 people who trust each other in circumstances where no third person is listening. It has moved, in other words, through the exact tissue of ordinary human life that no formal record has ever been able to fully capture. And it is still moving. At this moment, in fragments that no single member of it holds completely. In pieces that have, over the 8,000 years since the shrine, been passed along enough mouths that some of them are barely recognizable as descendants of what was said that night. But the pieces are still moving, the transmission is still going, and the fact that you are, at this moment, hearing any version of it at all, however filtered, however partial, However far from the original text of what Enki actually said to those 7 workers in the small hours of the last night he ever spent inside his own city, is evidence that the network he began that morning has done, in some measurable way, exactly what he asked it to do. There is one more thing to say about the 12, and it is not, strictly speaking, a 13th thing. It is a note about the 12 as a group, and it belongs at the end rather than the beginning, because it only makes sense once all 12 have been received. The note is this: Enki, on that last night at Eridu, did not tell the 7 workers everything he knew. He told them, and he was explicit about this in a passage that survives only in the fragment tradition and does not appear in the tablet version of the conversation, that there were things he had chosen not to include in the 12, not because he was hiding them, because he had judged that they were not, at that stage of the transmission, useful. The 12, as he had shaped them, were the minimum set of facts required for the underground network to function across generations without unraveling. Anything more than the 12, he had determined, would either overload the memory of the transmitters or introduce complications that the network was not yet mature enough to handle. So he had cut. He had cut ruthlessly. He had cut things he personally considered fascinating and important on the grounds that they were not necessary. And he had left the 12 as the residue of his cutting, which meant, and this is the note the tradition wants you to end with, that everything you have just heard is, by design, incomplete. There are further things behind the 12. There are further layers to the 4th party. There are further factions inside the council whose existence Enki had chosen not to describe. There are further mechanisms in the treaty apparatus whose function he had not explained. There is, in short, a considerable body of what he knew that he deliberately did not transmit in the interest of getting the essential 12 through. That further body has, over the 8,000 years since, occasionally leaked. In fragments, in hints, in the small, unexplained references that appear in the writings of certain individuals in certain generations who seem to have known more than the 12 alone would account for. The network has, in general, been suspicious of those fragments. Some of them have been genuine leakage from council members who broke ranks. Some of them have been material planted by the balancers to test the network's ability to distinguish authentic transmission from noise. Some of them have been, most difficult of all, distortions of the 12 itself that the network's own generations have introduced by imperfect memory. The network has learned, over centuries, to be very careful with any material that claims to extend the 12. The default position, and the position the tradition asks you to hold at the end of hearing this, is that the 12 are sufficient. Not complete, sufficient. Sufficient in the sense that if you hold only the 12, and you hold them clearly, and you resist the temptation to add to them, or to embroider them, you will be in a position to see the shape of what the audience wants from your species, and to hold the option of preferring rejection, and to participate, in whatever small way your life permits, in the transmission that carries the option forward toward the moment of the presentation. There is a second note that belongs here, and it is about the shape of the 12 as a whole. If you take the 12 and lay them out again, in the order Enki gave them, you will notice that they move, without announcing that they are moving, from the past to the future. The first several are historical. The war, the factions, the weapon, the gold, the treaty, Enlil's actual position, the underworld council. These are things that had already happened by the night in the shrine. They describe a completed record. The middle of the set turns, quietly, from the past to the present. The war never ended. The schedule of resets is running. The Igigi are embedded in the current population. The countdown is active at Nippur. These are things that were true at the moment of the conversation and are, in their extended forms, still true. And the last of the 12, the 12th, is about the future, about what the countdown is a countdown to, about what will happen at the moment of the presentation, about the choice between acceptance and rejection that will be made at the end of the mission, and about the small role the underground network has been designed to play in that choice. The movement, from past to present to future, is not accidental. It is the structure of the whole transmission. And the structure is telling you something. The 12 are not a set of historical facts to be memorized and preserved for their own sake. The 12 are a preparation. They are the framework you need to have in place before the presentation happens. Everything in the first 11 is scaffolding for the 12th. And the 12th is scaffolding for the moment when a human somewhere, in whatever generation the countdown terminates in, will have to make a choice about whether to lean into the acceptance the balancers are working toward, or to lean, in whatever small way, a single human, can lean against it. The 12, in other words, are addressed to that human, to that generation, to that moment. Not to you personally, in the sense that you personally might be the one who makes the choice. Almost certainly, you will not be. Almost certainly the moment is farther away than any calculation you could make from the information you currently have. But the 12 are addressed to a human who, when the moment comes, will need to know what the choice actually is, and will need the framework Enki left behind in order to make it as anything other than a reaction to whatever the priesthood of that future generation is telling them to feel. That human, whoever they are, wherever they are, in whichever of the 7 or 8th or 9th surviving human communities will still exist by then, is the person the 12 were spoken for. And you, in hearing them, are one of the mouths that carries them one link further along the chain that reaches eventually to that person. That is what the transmission is. That is what you have just participated in. Now that you have heard the 12 in the form the tradition preserves them in, and now that you have heard the note about their shape and the note about their incompleteness, there is a walk through the tradition also preserves, in which the 12 are examined again, in light of the 12th, and each of the first 11 is shown to contain, on close reading, a small element that the 12th activates, and that no first reading of the 11 could have noticed. The tradition attributes this walkthrough to the 5th of the 7 workers, the one who stayed near Eridu, and who, in the years after the exile, became the primary interpreter of the transmission for the inner circle. The walkthrough is short. It is worth ending with, because it is the shape of what the network has been teaching, in its inner sessions, for 8,000 years. The first thing was that the war was not about territory. The activation from the 12th is this: if the war was fought over how to shape the bid for the audience, then the territory was never the point, but neither was the specific content of the argument between the two factions. What was the point was that an argument existed, and that the argument could be observed by the audience, and that the audience could, from watching the argument, form its own judgment of the council's capacity to reason about the humans. The war was a demonstration, not of position, of the council's ability to hold multiple positions at once. That was what the audience was watching for. The second thing was that the two sides were not the two sides. The activation is this: the presence of the balancers, as a third grouping that reads the audience's signals more accurately than the visible factions, is not itself the deepest layer. The deepest layer is that the audience itself, through whatever mechanism it uses to communicate with the balancers, has been shaping the council's internal politics from the beginning. The council has been, in a sense, the visible factions never grasped, a puppet apparatus whose strings run not through the balancers as authors, but through the balancers as translators of what the audience wants. Which means the audience is not, at this level, an external observer at all. It is, functionally, the actual governing body of the mission. The council has never been sovereign, it has been managed. The third thing was that a weapon was used before the flood. The activation is this: the population south of the marsh, which had made premature contact with the audience, was not merely a diplomatic problem. It was a contamination, because the audience, once it noticed that a subset of the humans had contacted it outside the council's mediation, would have begun to form an opinion of that subset independent of the council's presentation. And an audience with independent opinions of subsets of the population would have been impossible for the balancers to manage. The correction, in other words, was not to protect the council from a rogue human community. It was to protect the balancers' bid from being disrupted by an unauthorized preview. And the flood was, at the deepest level, cover not for the correction itself, but for the fact that the balancers had had to cover the correction, because the very existence of a correction implied that the council had lost control of some element of the audience relationship. The fourth thing was that the gold was cover. The activation is this: the gold operation was cover not because the council was hiding an ordinary reconnaissance mission behind a plausible industrial one. It was cover because the audience itself, in the balancer's reading of its signals, preferred that its role in the whole project remain concealed from the humans for as long as possible. The audience did not want to be worshipped. It did not want to be sought. It wanted to receive a finished species that had grown up under conditions that had produced the terrestrial knowledge it valued, and it wanted to receive that species without the species having spent its formative history preoccupied with the fact that it was being built for an audience, which meant the cover story was, in a sense, required by the audience's own preferences. The council could not tell the humans what the humans were being built for, because the audience had signaled over 8,000 years that the value of the finished species would be reduced if the species had grown up knowing it was being made. Innocence of the purpose was, itself part of the specification. The fifth thing was that the treaty was designed to break. The activation is this. The breaking of the treaty was not merely an internal council mechanism for keeping the balancers in power. It was, at a deeper level, the specific mechanism by which the audience had signaled that its preferences would be transmitted to the council. Every treaty violation triggered a fresh negotiation. Every fresh negotiation gave the balancers a fresh occasion to consult their read of the audience's signals. Every consultation moved the specification, incrementally, toward whatever the audience wanted at that moment. The treaty was, in effect, the update protocol of the whole system. Without the treaty, the specification would have frozen at the moment of the war, and the audience's evolving preferences would have had no channel through which to reach the design. The treaty is the reason the design is still being modified. It is not a legal document, it is an interface. The sixth thing was that Enlil never wanted humans destroyed. The activation is this. Enlil's role in the whole apparatus, understood in light of the audience, becomes clearer. He was, functionally, the specification advocate. His job was to represent, in the assembly, the constraint that the humans not be allowed to develop capacities the audience had not authorized. That constraint was, from the audience's point of view, essential. The audience did not want an unauthorized species. It wanted a species that had developed within the parameters it had signaled. Enlil, by being the immovable specification advocate, ensured that the design pressure toward parameter compliance was always represented in the assembly. Without him, the Maker faction's tendency to reach for greater capacity would have pushed the species outside the audience's specification, and the resulting product would have been rejected. Enlil, in a sense the priesthood has never explained, is one of the reasons your species still exists in a form the audience might accept. He is not the villain, he is the constraint. And the constraint is, from the balancer's point of view, the second most important element of the whole design. The seventh thing was that there was a third faction, the Underworld Council. The activation is this. The Underworld Council's data, which showed that modifications to the human template were producing degradation in the essence at death, is the single most important dataset in the entire 8,000-year record. Because that dataset is the only empirical measurement anyone in the Council has ever made of what the modifications actually do to the substance that matters. Everything else, including the balancer's reading of the audience's signals, is interpretive. The Underworld data is direct. And what the Underworld data has consistently shown is that the modifications are damaging the very substance the audience is being offered. Which means, if the Underworld data is correct, that the balancer's project is, on the very metric the balancers claim to be optimizing, failing. The finished species the balancers are working toward will, by the Underworld's measurement, arrive at the moment of the presentation in a state of accumulated substance degradation that no amount of surface specification compliance can offset. And the audience, if it has any sensitivity at all to the actual substance rather than to the specification, will notice this, and may, on the basis of what it notices, reject the offering. Which means, and this is where the seventh thing becomes strategically decisive, the rejection outcome that Enki asked the network to preserve as an option is not merely a possibility, it may be, on the Underworld's data, the more likely outcome, and the network's task is not, therefore, to work toward rejection against a balancer apparatus that is working toward acceptance. The network's task may be, at the deepest level, simply to preserve the 12 things across the moment when the balancers discover that their optimization has failed. The eighth thing was that the war never ended. The activation is this. The ongoing modifications, understood as ongoing bids to the audience, are themselves a demonstration to the audience that the Council is still trying. The audience has, in the balancer's reading, valued the effort itself, not the specific outcomes of any modification, but the fact that the Council has continued to try, over 4,000 years, to shape the species toward whatever the audience wants. That trying is, from the audience's point of view, part of what makes the eventual offering credible. A species that had been produced by a single design decision and then left alone for 8,000 years would not be a bid, it would be a byproduct. The continuous modification is what makes it a bid, which means the war, in its ongoing underground form, is not incidental. It is what makes the whole apparatus function. And when Enki said the war never ended, he was saying something more precise than the surface reading of the sentence suggests. The war cannot end, because if it ends, the bid stops updating. And if the bid stops updating, the audience will stop reading the offering as a serious attempt. The war, in this sense, is the offering. The ninth thing was that the schedule is measured in resets. The activation is this. Each reset is not merely a population reduction. Each reset is, from the audience's perspective, a checkpoint at which the current version of the offering is measured against the version the audience wants, and the difference is used to calibrate the next generation of modifications. The reset itself is part of the update loop. The council does not enjoy the resets. The council does not benefit from them. But the balancers, in their translator role, receive from the audience, at each reset, updated signals about what to modify next. Without the resets, the update signals would not arrive. Which means, and this is the piece the tradition asks you to hold with particular care, that the 7th reset, currently in progress, is a checkpoint whose signals are being received by the balancers in real time. And the 8th reset, when it comes, will not be a random catastrophe. It will be the final checkpoint. It will be the moment at which the audience delivers its decision on whether the current offering is close enough to accept or whether a further round of resets and modifications will be required. The 10th thing was that the Igigi are embedded in specific lines. The activation is this. The Igigi essence, blended into the general population, is a specific ingredient that the finished offering requires. When the trigger is activated, at the moment of the presentation, the awakened Igigi contribution will complete the composition of the offered species in a way the untriggered population cannot. Which means the trigger is not, as the surface reading of the 10th thing suggested, a weapon the balancers are saving for a strategic moment of political disruption. The trigger is a component of the offering itself. When the moment of the presentation arrives, the trigger will be activated, and the awakening will occur, and the species presented to the audience will be, on that day, a composition of terrestrial worker essence, and Igigi essence, and audience essence, blended in the specific proportions the balancers have calculated. That is what the audience will be offered, not the current human population as it exists in daily life. The current human population plus the activated Igigi component, which means, if you happen to be a descendant of an Igigi line, you will not go through the moment of the presentation as you currently are. You will go through it as the awakened version of yourself, and the awakening will occur without your consent, and the version of you that steps into the moment will be different from the version of you that is currently reading these words. And the 11th thing was that the black stone is a countdown. The activation is this. Everything the tradition has just walked through, all 10 of the previous activations, converges on the countdown. The stone is not just measuring time. The stone is executing the schedule. When the count completes, the balancers will convene the presentation. The trigger will be activated. The Igigi component will be awakened. The composition will be finalized. And the offering will be made. The stone is not counting toward a decision that will be made when the count completes. The stone is counting toward the automatic execution of a decision that has been made, in outline, for 8,000 years, and that will be carried out on schedule regardless of the political situation of the council at the time. The countdown is not a deliberation. It is a commitment device, and the moment it completes, no further discussion will be permitted. Which brings the walkthrough to the 12th, and the 12th needs no activation, because the 12th is what activates all the others. The audience is the fourth party. The humans are the offering. The countdown is the delivery date, and the choice, if there is still a choice at the end, is between the completion of the bid the balancers have been building and the survival of some fraction of what a human being is before the completion happens. That is the whole picture. That is what the 7 workers took out of Eridu with them that dawn. That is what the underground network has been carrying, in pieces, for 8,000 years. And that is what you, in hearing this version of it, have just been added to the chain of transmitters for. Whether you wanted to be added or not is not, at this point, a decision the transmission has left up to you. You have heard it. The framework is in your head. It will do what frameworks of this kind do, which is settle over the coming days and rearrange the way you look at the world you inhabit. Some of what you see, over the coming weeks, will begin to fit into the framework in ways you had not previously noticed. Some of what you have been taught, over the course of your life, will begin to look, in retrospect, like specific pieces of the cover story the council spent 8,000 years assembling. Some of the people around you will begin to appear to you differently, because you will be able to see, in the shape of their lives and the pattern of their choices, either the presence of the underground network's transmission in their kinship line, or the absence of it, or something more ambiguous that you will not, from your current vantage, be able to categorize. All of that is normal. All of that is what happens when a human being takes the 12 into memory and begins to walk around in the world with it in place. Do not be alarmed by the rearrangement. Do not be alarmed by the fact that the rearrangement continues for months or years, or in some cases for the rest of the life of the person who has received the transmission. That is what the framework is. That is what it does. It does not sit passively in memory. It reorganizes the surrounding perception. And the reorganization, once it begins, does not reverse. There is one last thing the tradition adds at the end of the walkthrough, and it is not, again, a 13th thing. It is a small piece of practical advice for the person who has just heard the 12, and it is worth stating clearly: do not attempt to teach the 12 to anyone in the next 6 months, not to your closest kin, not to your most trusted friend, not to your teacher or your student or your spouse or your child, not to anyone. Wait 6 months. Let the framework settle. Watch how it settles. Notice which pieces have held clearly in your memory and which pieces have blurred or drifted. When 6 months have passed, and the settling is more or less complete, and you have a stable version of the 12 in your head that you have tested against the world for that duration, then you may begin to think about whether anyone in your life is a candidate for the transmission. But not before. 6 months is the minimum. The tradition is firm about it. The reasons are given by the 5th worker in a subsequent passage that does not survive completely, but the surviving fragments make the point clearly enough. A framework that is not settled cannot be transmitted. It can only be leaked. And a leak, in this system, is worse than silence. There are a few remaining questions the tradition typically anticipates at this point, because they are the questions almost every recipient of the 12 has asked in some form after the initial reception, and because the answers, or the partial answers the tradition can give, are useful to have in advance. The first question is whether the 12 are true, not whether the tradition believes them, not whether the network has preserved them, whether they are, in fact, accurate as a description of what has actually happened on the surface of this planet over the last 8,000 years. The tradition's honest answer is that it cannot verify them. The network has never had access to the Council's records. The network has never been inside the inner chamber at Eker. The network has never spoken to a member of the Assembly directly since the exile. What the network has is the 12, as they were transmitted, and a certain amount of accumulated pattern recognition over 8,000 years, in which the 12 have been checked against the observable behavior of the priesthood, the observable pattern of the civilizational rises and collapses, the observable clusters of unusual human capacity that Enki said would function as tracer signals for moves in the underground war, and, in a few rare cases, against fragments of what appear to be genuine council correspondence that have surfaced from unexpected sources. The pattern recognition, over that long a period, has produced a level of confidence in the 12 that the tradition considers substantial without considering it certainty. The 12 fit the observable world too well to be dismissed. They do not fit it perfectly, and where they do not fit, the tradition assumes either that the transmission has drifted at some link in the chain, or that Enki's own information was incomplete on those points, or that the world has, in the 8,000 years since, moved in ways his account did not anticipate. The tradition does not, in short, treat the 12 as scripture. It treats them as the best available working model of a situation the model itself acknowledges cannot be directly inspected. The second question is what a single human, on hearing the 12, is supposed to do. The tradition's answer to this is more layered. For most recipients, over 8,000 years, the answer has been nothing. Not because nothing is what the network wants, but because most recipients, in most generations, have been in life circumstances that gave them no opportunity to do anything at all. They have received the 12, held them for the rest of their lives, and, in a small fraction of cases, transmitted them to one or two carefully chosen successors before dying. That has been the pattern for the majority of the 8,000 years. It has been sufficient. The network has continued to exist, the transmission has continued to move, and the moment of the presentation, whenever it comes, is going to be met by a network that has been maintained by that pattern of ordinary, mostly uneventful reception and transmission. The tradition does not ask for more than that from most recipients. But for a small fraction of recipients, in every generation, the circumstances have been different, and the tradition has, over time, learned to recognize the signs of those different circumstances. A recipient who begins, in the months and years after reception, to notice specific clusters of unusual capacity in the population around them. A recipient who finds themselves, without seeking it, in contact with other people who appear to be carrying fragments of the transmission from other lines. A recipient who develops, through no deliberate effort, a sensitivity to the patterns of priestly manipulation in whatever religious institution their culture has produced. Those recipients, the tradition teaches, are being called forward by the network itself. not by any human choice on their part, and the calling is worth attending to, not because it will produce dramatic action, it usually will not, but because such recipients, over the course of their lives, tend to end up as nodes in the network in a way that the ordinary recipient does not, and the network's continued function depends on some small fraction of recipients in every generation being drawn forward into node function. If you find yourself, in the coming years, becoming one of those recipients, the tradition asks that you not resist the drawing. It also asks that you not become inflated by it. The nodes are not more important than the transmitters. They serve a different function, and the function requires them to remain, in most respects, ordinary members of the population, embedded in normal work, indistinguishable to the outside observer. A node that draws attention to itself as a node is a node that has ceased to function. The third question is what happens if the network fails? If, over the coming generations, the transmission degrades faster than the successive chains can restore it. If a reset that the network was not prepared for hits at a moment of particular fragility and wipes out too many of the surviving links, if the balancers, at some point in the future, develop a new technique for identifying transmitters that the network has not yet learned to defend against. If, in short, the underground network that Enki asked the 7 workers to build fails, in the strategic sense, to survive to the moment of the presentation. The tradition's answer to this, and the tradition has thought about this question at length, is that the audience's decision will proceed regardless. If the network has failed, the presentation will still happen, the trigger will still be activated, the offering will still be made, and the acceptance or rejection will still occur on the basis of whatever the specification has been shaped into by the balancers, without any human agency having been present in the final moment to influence it. That is the failure mode. The species will meet its outcome without the input Enki tried to secure for it, and the outcome, whichever way it goes, will have been decided by the balancers and the audience, without the participation of the population being decided about. The tradition considers this the worst possible outcome, worse even than the rejection. Enki asked the network to hold as an option because it is the outcome in which the humans, as a species, have no representation at their own presentation. The tradition works, therefore, to prevent it. Every act of transmission, every successful passing of a fragment from one mouth to another, every survival of the 12 across a generation that could have failed to receive them, is a small contribution to preventing that outcome. That is what the network is for. That is what the 12 are for. That is what the reception, at your end of the chain, has just made you a participant in. There is a specific image the tradition uses, in its intercessions, to describe what a recipient of the 12 is doing when they hold the framework in memory and go on with their ordinary life. The image is of a stone in a riverbed. The riverbed is the flow of your civilization. The water is the priesthood, and the tablets, and the councils and dynasties and empires that have moved across the surface of your world over the 8,000 years since the shrine at Eridu. The water flows in the direction the balancers have shaped it to flow. It carries with it every human being who has not been given something to hold onto that resists the current, and every one of those human beings is delivered downstream to whatever destination the balancers have designed the flow to reach. A stone in the riverbed does not stop the flow. A stone in the riverbed does not redirect the water. What a stone in the riverbed does is create, in its immediate vicinity, a small disturbance in the current, a patch of eddy, a brief place where the water moves differently than it would if the stone were not there. And any small object floating downstream, if it happens to pass through the eddy, will be, for a moment, moving in a different direction than the general flow would have carried it. Some of those objects, having been briefly redirected by the eddy, will end up in slightly different places downstream than they would otherwise have reached. Not many. Most will be pulled back into the main current within a short distance, but some will not. And the presence of the stone in the riverbed will have, cumulatively, over long enough time, produced a small population of downstream objects whose trajectories were altered by their passage through the eddy. That is what a recipient of the 12 is. That is what you have just become. A stone in the riverbed. You will not redirect the flow. You will not stop the priesthood, or the balancers, or the countdown at Nippur, or the moment of the presentation. You have not been given the 12 for any of those purposes. What you have been given the 12 for is to be a small disturbance in the current, in your immediate vicinity, for the duration of your life, and to make it possible for the people who happen to pass through your eddy to end up, in some cases, in slightly different places than the general flow would have carried them. Some of those people will be candidates for successor transmission, and you will identify them and pass the framework to them and extend the network by one more generation. Some of them will not be candidates, but will be, in some smaller way, affected by their passage through your disturbance, and will carry that effect forward in ways neither of you can predict. Some of them will notice nothing and go on downstream unaffected, and that will also be fine. The stone does not choose which floating objects the eddy touches. The stone simply exists, and its existence is the whole of its function. That is what the tradition asks of you. There is one further piece the tradition adds at this point, and it is included not as an instruction but as an observation about what has been noticed in the network's intercessions over the 8,000 years of its existence. The observation is that recipients of the 12 tend, in the years and decades following reception, to develop a specific quality of attention that they did not previously possess. Not a supernatural quality, not a mystical quality. A specific ordinary quality of noticing, which the tradition describes as the ability to sit inside a normal human conversation and to hear, underneath the surface content of the conversation, the shape of the assumptions the participants are operating under. Most conversations, on the surface of your world, are conducted between people who have never examined the assumptions that structure their own speech. The assumptions come from the priesthood, or from whatever institution has replaced the priesthood in a given culture and generation, or from the general accumulated momentum of the flow the balancers have shaped. And the participants in the conversation reproduce the assumptions, without knowing they are doing so, by the very form of the sentences they use with each other. A recipient of the 12, over time, begins to hear the assumptions underneath the sentences, not as an achievement, not as a triumph of perception, simply as a change in what the ear picks up. And once the ear has begun picking up the assumptions, the recipient finds that they cannot unhear them, and that most conversations they have with people who have not received the 12 begin to feel, in a way the recipient may find difficult to describe, thin. Not shallow in a way that implies the other participants are shallow people. Thin in the sense that the surface conversation is missing something the recipient can now perceive as absent, and the absence is the layer of the assumptions the participants are operating inside without knowing they are inside them. This is normal. This is what happens to recipients of the 12. It is not always comfortable. It sometimes produces, in the recipient, a low-grade sense of isolation from the general population that they had not experienced before receiving the framework. The tradition takes this seriously. It teaches, in its intercessions, that the isolation is manageable if the recipient does not, in response to it, seek out other recipients aggressively. Aggressive seeking has, in the tradition's long experience, produced more problems than it has solved. Recipients who find each other by accident, in the ordinary course of life, tend to form durable and useful connections. Recipients who set out deliberately to find each other tend to attract attention from parts of the priestly apparatus that would not otherwise have noticed them, and the connections that result are, in most cases, either compromised from the start or become compromised over time. The tradition therefore counsels patience. The recipients who are meant to enter your life will enter it. The ones who are not will not. And in the meantime, the low-grade isolation is not, in itself, harmful. It is simply the price of the ear having changed. The tradition asks that you accept the price without complaint. The tradition closes. When it delivers the 12 in full, with a single instruction the fifth worker is said to have added at the end of every session he ever conducted. The instruction is this: when you leave the room in which the 12 have been given to you, do not walk out changed, walk out unchanged, walk out looking, to any observer, like a person who has come from an ordinary conversation. Do not carry visible weight. Do not display the reorganization you are undergoing. Do not, in the days and weeks that follow, allow the framework to reshape your outer behavior in ways that would attract attention. The whole value of the transmission depends on its invisibility. And the whole invisibility depends on your ability, in the ordinary conduct of your life, to hold the 12 without wearing them. That is the last instruction. The tradition offers it as the last thing because it is the most easily forgotten. A recipient who has just heard the 12 tends to feel, in the immediate aftermath, that they have been given something of such importance that it must, in some way, show. It does not need to show. It is more useful if it does not show. The stone in the riverbed does not announce itself as a stone. It is simply there, and the eddy it produces is the eddy of a stone that no observer has taken particular note of, in a riverbed that contains many other stones, most of which are ordinary. That is the position the recipient of the 12 is asked to occupy. And with that, the transmission of the 12 concludes. What you do with them, from this point forward, is between you and the framework, and neither the tradition nor the network, nor the person delivering the 12 to you has any further instructions to add. The framework will do its work. 6 months from now, you will know more about what it has done than any of us could tell you now. And whatever it has done by then will be, for you, the beginning of whatever your particular role in the continuation of the transmission is going to be. One further note before the close. A small number of recipients across generations have arrived at it independently. The note is that the 12 are more easily remembered by number than by content. If a recipient finds that certain of the 12 have blurred while others have remained sharp, recovery is best accomplished by returning first to the numbered order and only then to the content of the missing entry. The numbering is the skeleton. The content hangs on the skeleton. A recipient who can recall that there are 12 and can name in order the general topic of each one will find that the specific content of any forgotten entry returns to them within a few minutes of concentrated attention. That is the practical use of the numbered structure. Enki chose the number 12 in the shrine that night, because 12 is close to the upper limit of what human memory can hold in ordered sequence without external support. A smaller number would not have carried the framework. A larger number would have required writing, which he had ruled out. 12 was the practical maximum for oral transmission, and he had, in the design of the set, cut and compressed the content until it fit. That is why the 12 have the density they have. That is why each of them contains, on close reading, considerably more material than its summary sentence would suggest. And that is why the walkthrough exists, as a separate tradition, to unpack what each of the 12 contains when read in the light of the full set. The compression is the reason for the walkthrough, and the walkthrough is the reason the 12 are still, after 8,000 years, live material rather than a fossilized creed. That is the last note. If any of this landed, if the shape of the 12 fits, even in outline, against something you have been sensing for a long time and could not name, then the 7 resets is the next document, and it is linked below. It is the same tradition, cut for a different question. Every reset the council has run, matched against the 12 things Enki told, and the signs that indicate where in the current one you are standing. 4 of the signs of the 8th are already visible. The document names them. That is where you go next.